Are we live? We're live.
OBS Studio.
So, on this special edition of Theological Dark Web, this should open with a disclaimer. This is not the video that you want to share with your Bible study group. So, it might not even be appropriate for children. This is going to live up to its, or this episode, Theological Dark Web, is going to live up to its name. This is information that you would not hear in churches, and you might not even want to watch this video. So, but the idea is to be open to all kinds of crazy ideas. So we're going to have a discussion, and having talked with my friend Zach here a little bit, there's a chance that this video might actually start the religion that ends with the Antichrist and the apocalypse. So I hope that those of you who know me and know that I've talked about how I might accidentally start the apocalypse before will still be my friends if this ends up being the trigger point. So this is my friend Zach Doty. Say hi, Zach.
Hey.
No, you're supposed to say hi, Zach.
Hi, Zach.
There you go. And okay, from here, let's just all pretense off and let's
Yeah.
just go nuts.
Yeah, what do you want to talk about?
Lately it's been about power structures in churches and statements of faith, and the fact that there's a narrative that's full of propositional statements that's in all of the churches, and it's used for identifying people who are part of the in-group and for putting people out of the in-group and creating this us and them frame of mind. And it's all based on survivability of being part of the in-group, which is kind of, well, Paul calls it being carnally minded or worldly minded, which makes perfect sense because you have a better chance of survival if you're in a community.
Yeah.
And of course, the problem with that is all this, it ends up being tyranny. So you have a select few who are the gatekeepers of orthodoxy. Mm-hmm. These are the propositional statements that we must affirm in order to be part of the in-group, and etc. And
well, I mean, that's at the root of my departure from the faith, was understanding the dynamics behind groupthink, whether you want to call it groupthink or conformity bias or herd behavior or, social conditioning, or the tendency of us to resign our cognitive autonomy to others.
Outsourcing our thinking.
Outsourcing thinking, right? And
Yep.
So understanding this really was the first catalyst for me to decide that I had to actively re-examine everything that I thought I believed, and redevelop epistemology from first principles. And for me, the Ash experiment was the inescapable, confronting piece of evidence that demonstrably showed me my susceptibility to conformity bias.
Okay.
Right.
So for the people who don't know, being Ash negative, Ash positive, the Ash experiment is basically you sit a bunch of people in a room and you say, which line is longer? And you draw two lines, one's clearly longer. And then only one person is the test subject and everybody else is part of this game. And the whole room will raise their hands at the shorter line and say, that's the longer line. Well, what is it? 40% of people?
It's like upwards of 80% of people conform within a few minutes. It just kind of increases the longer you conduct the test. But to me, it was astounding that so many people would conform to a lie about a black and white line that's 10 feet in front of them when they're surrounded by a few strangers and clearly in test conditions. So if the human psyche is so vulnerable to exploitation through this need to fit a consensus narrative, to be part of an in-group, which we can see from the polemicy in the political environment, that's clearly everyone feels the need to align themselves with one side of a narrative. If we are this susceptible to exploitation by that type of thinking, then we really need to be careful if we find ourselves thinking normative thoughts. If we find ourselves thinking anything,
if we agree with the group, there's something wrong. There's
right?
Something seriously wrong.
If you're not significantly heterodoxical in your views of the world, then
You're probably being influenced
right.
by groupthink.
Yes.
Yeah. And you went through a journey of at one point being a hardcore like hyper Calvinist, right?
Yeah, I was raised Christian, so I never knew a day in my childhood when I didn't think it was true. I remember as a young child praying the sinner's prayer and trusting that I was redeemed by the salvific work of Christ on the cross. At that point, I didn't know any theology. I was like 3 or 4 years old, but I remember the event. Um, I remember being passionate about my faith throughout my childhood, throughout my young adolescence, and in my early teens, delving into theological inquiry. I remember amassing a library of just tomes of work on theology, every systematic theology I could get my hands on, I
Mm-hmm.
would devour, and I ended
And
up I
by
ended up in discussions with a Presbyterian minister who actually just passed away a few weeks ago. He was a really good friend of mine, and he challenged my Arminian thinking and gave me lots of books to read
Mhm.
that ended up moving me towards and all the way towards Calvinistic, even hyper Calvinistic thinking.
So by Arminian versus Calvinist, most people reduce that down to you can lose your salvation, you cannot lose your salvation, right? Is that how you thought of it at the time, or?
It was we at the time when I became a Calvinist, I thought of it much more about your orientation towards causality, towards God being the only cause, the
Mhm.
sovereignty of God. But of course,
Meaning something like full determinism, right?
yeah, full determinism, predestination, right? The full tulip,
Mhm.
total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and the preservation of the saints. And included in that was active reprobation. Um, it was a very, it was a very traditional Calvinistic view, much
Mhm.
like Calvin himself would have held to, which today is typically considered hyper Calvinistic if you teach active reprobation.
And you actually read the Institutes, right?
Yeah, when I was maybe 14 or 15.
The whole thing, and yeah, and by the way, for our audience, Zach is strange, sort of savant level intelligence when it comes to consuming literature and retaining it and understanding it, and so he and I have in common that we don't relate to most people. Um, we feel sort of like aliens in the wrong kind of world, but we relate to each other. We're both really strange, apparently. My wife has informed me of this, that I'm not normal, and otherwise I probably wouldn't notice. Um, and Zach is probably a little bit more not normal than me. I see some of the things that he does in social situations and how it makes people feel uncomfortable, and I also see how brilliant he is. And I think you hit a certain level of being able to comprehend things, and social norms kind of go out the window, and it's partly intentional. Like I think sometimes those of us who are really socially strange are actually doing it because we're conducting an experiment at all points in time, because we're aware of conformity and social norms, and uh, we're curious like why they exist, and we want to see what happens if we just do strange things. Like,
Yeah, I mean, you really get to a point where you realize the danger of unconsciously conforming to the crowd behavior, and then you find that you optimize for heterodoxy, and that's a very revealing process of. In fact, there's a book I just recently read. I've read it a few times, but I read it again like a month ago, called The Art of Nonconformity, and it's just on intentionally doing things differently because you discover more, you learn more. It's the path of accelerated learning, and you find things out about. Sometimes you find out why there's a good reason that the crowd does things the way they do it, and other times you find out why that's a local optima and there's a global optima that most people just never discover. And typically you find out that the crowd converges on the safest option. And ironically, the least safe option is trying to optimize for safety. Optimizing for freedom and adventure and other things in life is more rewarding and ironically provides more safety and security than optimizing for security directly. But it seems like the crowd always converges on thinking it's optimized for security and minimizing risk. And so eventually you become pro risk and you start to differentiate between perceived risk and actual risk, especially in social situations. And you start to like actively look for the asymmetries in risks and bets in life and exploiting those because um, all normative behavior is effective for survival without thinking, right? It's called being conservative for a reason because you conserve the energy of having to think for yourself. That's the thing being conserved. If you are a mindless creature, the best path is to stay with the herd and stay with the group. However, if you're willing to put in the work to intentionally and proactively architect your own life, the path of least resistance, the wide path, is never the best option. There's always a panoply of options that are far better, that are far more rarefied. And so you find out sometimes the irony of life is that the things that look easiest are hardest, the things that look hardest are easiest, simply because there's no competition for hard things. There's competition for easy things. And this is just true everywhere in life that people take the path of least resistance, least effort, and least thinking. And so eventually you start to find joy in being different.
Yeah, there's something about this way of thinking that's also dangerous, because you find yourself, questioning the fundamental nature of reality. So, say you take my situation. I was raised in a very controlled environment, very much isolated, and with a narrative that was something like evangelical Christianity. And as I began to observe strange and illogical things that people within that group were doing or concluding, and the discrepancy between what they viewed as reality and what was observable as reality continued to be more poignant, I guess, as I got older and started to think. It makes you wonder, well, what's really real then?
Yeah.
People are afraid of things like poisonous snakes. Why are they afraid of things like poisonous snakes? Maybe poisonous snakes are
I
fine. I don't know. And then you start taking strange risks, and so you're pushing towards insanity.
Yeah,
You,
well, there's a fine line between genius and insanity. Um, and insanity, actual insanity, is often a misnomer. Often it just means nonconformist. So a lot of times, nonconformity or heterodoxy is considered insane simply because it's considered insane to not subscribe to the consensus.
yeah, and if you like, I talked to, I have one friend who's, you know, savant level intelligence, and his parents didn't know what to do with him, and they took him to psychologists, and the psychologists were trying to figure out what he was and trying to understand him. And in the meantime, he's frustrated with the incompetence of the psychologists who are incorrectly evaluating him. Um, so there's these people who are trying to figure out what to do with you, which ends up further alienating you and further reinforcing this sense that everyone else is incompetent. And I'm not really sure where I'm going with this, but there's this weird kind of, once you start alienating yourself from what is normative, it reinforces the fact that you recognize what's normative is crazy or is wrong or is just herd mentality, and it makes you retreat further and further away from heterodoxy. And in some fields, you can easily show that the majority is always wrong. That's fairly straightforward. whatever the majority is doing, that's what you know for sure is not correct. But in other things that are more, simple, the majority is generally right. Like if you've got 100 people together, you line them up in front of a door to a house that's open and say, what's the fastest way to get into the house? Well, most people are going to identify that the fastest way to get into the house is to walk into the open door. And then you're going to get some skeptical people who suspect, something is going on here. There's a trick, and they might be looking for something else. But in this case, let's say that the right answer is to just walk through the front door. Well, most of the people are going to get it right. But then if you add some complexity to it, then you're going to decrease the number of people who are going to get the right answer. And so it is probably the case that the statement, the majority is always wrong, is more like something that should be plotted on a graph where the level of wrongness of the majority is um, equivalent to or on some kind of a bell curve related to the complexity of the system. Would that make sense?
Yeah, I would say that in general, groupthink tends towards overgeneralization. Um, like there's two fundamental ways that your model of reality can be wrong, and that is you overfit or you underfit. Um, typically, so I think, yeah, I think most people just don't take a path of lifelong learning, right? And so they're better off just believing what everyone else says. It is too risky for them to venture out into their own opinions on everything.
Mm-hmm.
But in this day and age, when education is free and you can learn basically anything online, it's just a matter of choice whether you choose to prioritize entertainment or education. And so, I mean, I see that as the way forward. If we're going, I mean, I think we're at a point of existential crisis where the world needs to evolve beyond these.
Mass formation psychosis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If we're going to make it, the world needs to have a inflection point, a turning point where it wakes up to the necessity of dealing with the actual issues rather than just focusing on what the media wants to talk about.
When I went to Bible college, I talked to some of the professors, and I said, you've got all this information that you're presenting here in these classes, and I have no idea whether or not this information is true, if it's been verified, if it's infected with presuppositions. So it's basically all useless to me, or it's less than useless. It's like it's overcomplicating these issues such that I have a whole lot more work to do in order to find what's reality, given all of this noise that you've added to the system. And the professors who, they reacted to me by saying, well, but it's so much more work for you to have to go all the way back to first principles and learn this yourself. You'll get so much farther if you build off of what we've already established. And so that's one of the myths that accounts for why people will all follow the lemmings off the cliff, essentially. It's kind of like laziness, or there's a million reasons why people defer to somebody who is the figurehead. But it's ultimately going to end in, you're going to jump off the cliff with all the other lemmings.
Yeah. Where it's going to end is an interesting, fascinating question. I mean, we're at such a rapidly changing point in history where the next 10 years are not going to be anything like the past. I spend a lot of my time as just kind of studying the future. Kind of an amateur, but like that's kind of my passion, is just trying to predict the future.
What do you actually do?
I like learning about things. I don't know. I do a lot of things. I don't have any. I get bored quickly, so that I just move on to something new.
Yeah, I know you trade in cryptocurrencies.
I have in the past, yeah.
You have several businesses that you run, right? You're a software developer.
I like programming.
You memorized the Bible in Hebrew at one point, probably? Not exactly.
No, not exactly. I memorized some of it, some of the New Testament in Greek.
Yeah.
But that was when I was young.
Yeah, and me and Zach have kind of this same weird quirk where, Like I can open up a passage of scripture and glance at it and then recite the whole thing to you just at a glance. That's not difficult for me. And I thought that was normal. And, we could say it's a gift, but it's a weird quirk of our
Yeah.
ability to consume information.
But I would say in general, like I'm just all over the board. I like adventure. I like philosophy. I like science. I like math. I'd say my biggest passion in the last few years has been researching artificial intelligence. I'm basically just a amateur hobbyist AI researcher, which means I devour dozens of papers on archive.org every week, keeping current with the latest developments in architectures and neural networks. And it's a fascinating space. It's exciting and terrifying at the same time. And so that's where most of my thinking has been focused the last few years. Um,
So as I understand it, um, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I probably am because I don't follow it like you do, but the the basic paradigm for AI hasn't changed a lot, and it's something like a linear regression, right?
so the the basic paradigm in AI had the biggest change was probably in 2012 with the image net competition being won by DeepNet. But like the whole perceptron idea dates back to the 50s, and then you had the multi-layer perceptron, um, and there was then good old-fashioned AI or GoFi, and it really didn't catch on in any commercial applications though until 2012, when for the first time ever the good old-fashioned AI was beat by um, a deep neural network. And the basic idea of an artificial neural network or deep neural network is to make problems differentiable. In other words, make them continuous functions that are not like they don't have any kind of disjoints, so you can differentiate the loss at any point. And then these are huge parametric models with lots of parameters, and you randomly initialize the networks with a bunch of values, and then you do a forward pass through that network where um, you just multiply times what they call the weight, add the bias, run it through an activation function, typically a nonlinear activation function, something like a sigmoid. Um, Linear functions have been used as well, but and then you take what it predicts at the end and you calculate some loss like a L1 or L2 loss, a squared loss, and then you calculate the partial derivative of that loss back through the network, and you look at every parameter and calculate the partial derivative of loss for that parameter to see how significantly that parameter contributed to the error that the network made,
Mm-hmm.
and then you take one gradient step in the direction of lowering the loss, and you just repeat that process. So this is the standard like bare bones basic neural network. You make forward passes, then you back propagate the loss, and you take a gradient step, and you batch your data, and you normalize it and shuffle it. And this is what's been done really since 2012 at scale with libraries like Keras or TensorFlow or PyTorch.
Mm-hmm.
And at this point, anyone can build one in like 5 minutes with a few lines of code.
Mm-hmm.
But the fun stuff for me is trying to figure out what's the path between that and true human level intelligence. And right now it's like this branching tree with all these buds, and it's not clear which ones will end up being full branches and which ones will end up dying out.
Yeah.
And
So for the people who are listening to this, uh, the way that AI works in English would be something like, let's say you wanted to create some kind of really cool computer program that did some really complicated thing, like identified the difference between dogs and blueberry muffins in images. And you have no idea how to go about this because it's really, really hard. So you create a ton of math formulas, you put them all sort of strung together, you check, is it identifying them correctly? You tweak it a little bit, you check again, you tweak it a little bit, and since computers can run this, millions and millions of times in seconds, you eventually, through something like trial and error, but sort of a guided trial and error where you're weighting uh, the direction that you're moving, you eventually come up with the right set of formulas to do the task. And in the end, you end up with some computer program that you're not necessarily sure how it's working,
Yeah, you end
but
up with a black box algorithm.
yeah, it gives you the results that you want. So
Right.
it's really kind of like leveraging the fact that computers can do tons and tons and tons of iterations to
Yeah.
do trial and error to sort of evolve a
Yeah,
computer program that does the thing that you're trying to get it to do.
and some of it is more just random guessing, like a genetic algorithm or some kind of an evolutionary search algorithm where you have a population and you just do permutations or crossover mutations. And I'm actually fascinated by that branch of AI research as well. Um, Most of the industry is using gradient descent, so they look at the direction of the gradient of loss and then they just take a step in that direction. It's kind of like trying to find your way down a hill and then just taking these big steps. Uh, the problem with that is, of course, you can get stuck in local optima, and if you can't find a gradient to descend, you could be in this local optima where, or local minimum or maximum, right, where there's actually a global minimum or maximum that's far better, but you just can't find it because you can't discover the gradient.
So to put that in English, you've described the win conditions or the goal that you're trying to get your program to achieve in a too vague a way, or you aren't describing your goal correctly, and so your linear regression or whatever process of evolving your program ends up satisfying the conditions that you've described, but it's not what you want.
Yeah, I mean, and it's you could almost think of each little neuron as being like a separate little linear classifier, linear regression classifier, but think about all of them together, right? And typically you use a nonlinear function like a sigmoid to squash the output into a range between like 0 and 1, just to normalize the data as it's feeding through the network.
We don't want to get too far into the weeds for this audience.
Sure.
I mean, you and I could go crazy probably.
It's really fun. I'm mostly, like I said, I'm mostly interested in the gap from what exists today. Like I study all the current models like transformers, multi-headed attention, all that stuff, but I'm mostly interested in the gap from here to human level. And I study a lot of neuroscience and try to correlate the concepts between the two.
How would you say, because it's radically different the way that people learn and the way that AI learns. There's similarities,
There are similarities. There's a lot of similarities. And
but I've raised children. You've raised children.
Mhm.
You know that they will learn from playing with one kind of block and immediately be able to take that information and apply it to a completely different kind of block that's a different color and a different
Yep.
shape, but they learn stacking. And our
Yeah.
current models of AI can't do that kind of stuff.
So I'm very interested in models that can do all those things. So models that represent knowledge in modular, composable ways. I'm very interested in continuous learning models, or what are called online learning models, that learn throughout their existence. They don't just train them and then use them. They're just constantly learning throughout their existence. I'm very interested in things that solve the catastrophic forgetting problem, which is where you train a neural network on one thing and then you try to train it something else, it starts to forget this. Very interested in neural networks that are sparse. They're more efficient, right? The brain runs on 20 watts, but to run an equivalent sized network artificially on a Van Neumann architecture chip, you're going to be spending at least 20 kilowatts to run 86 billion neurons and 100 trillion synaptic connections. The 100 trillion, yeah, it's going to be more than that. So, and that's just for inference, not for training. So the brain's 1,000 times more power efficient than the most power efficient ASICs for neural networks right now. But we're making huge year-over-year gains on all fronts. And I'm very excited about the developments in neuromorphic substrates. So there's actually analog neuromorphic substrates being developed right now that will have memristor or transistor-like properties that give it the ability to learn in situ, learn as this process, it just on its own. So we're going to have matter that has brain-like properties where you can have inputs and outputs, and the structure of the matter will just adapt. And at that point, we get to at least 3 or 4 orders of magnitude in efficiency gains, probably more like 6 to 8 orders of magnitude efficiency gains. And then we're going to have the ability to create brains as big as we want. I really think the next 10 years holds I really think we're literally in the limit of the function of intelligence. We're approaching the asymptote. We're in this explosion period, and in the next 10 years, maybe 15, but probably within 10 years, we will have
Singularity.
AGI intelligence that's far surpassing human level
Well,
intelligence in everything.
we're already at a point where we can leverage what we can do with current AIs in order to develop new paradigms for AI. And it's where it's a kind of a transition phase, learning how to leverage AI to create better models, but it's already being done. And
Right.
so we're approaching that exponential curve. And so the intelligence or the effectiveness of what we can do with AI is doing something like this. And we're about here. And once it gets to here, then we're going to hit singularity.
Yeah, for the last 10 years, the best guess is that AI is doubling in power about every 6 months. OpenAI has an article arguing it's every 3.4 months. Uh, More recently, I've seen that maybe it's a little slower in the last few years. I looked at a paper on that was like just yesterday that was published, trying to figure out exactly how fast that is. But quantum computers are also improving exponentially. I'm thinking that the year-over-year gains on quantum computers, when you consider the error correction algorithms, the logical qubits, I think we're at over 100x just in the last year with the
Yeah.
IBM Eagle.
And something else that's interesting is we are way beyond the point of any power structure being able to regulate this. So
Oh, well, absolutely.
the government at this point cannot impose regulations upon the development of AI, whether or not we should, as Elon Musk put it, release the demon, something like whatever he said. It's no longer something that anyone can control because a 16-year-old kid can learn about TensorFlow and can use that to develop a new paradigm. And who knows? It could be
Yeah,
that AGI, which would be general intelligence, for the listeners. Narrow intelligence is like you can train a computer to play chess.
right.
That computer that can play chess has no idea how to play backgammon. But a general AI would be something that could learn to play chess and could take principles from chess and then immediately apply that to something like checkers, learn checkers much faster than if it hadn't learned chess in the first place, then could apply that to every area, something general. So more like the way that children learn. Because if you teach a child chess and they learn how to do it, then checkers is easy. It's simple. And then other games end up being, depending on their similarity to chess, they're also easy. But
Yeah.
AI is narrow. It will forget how to play chess if you then train it how to play checkers. And so that's the problem of transitioning from narrow AI to general AI.
Yeah, basically representations of knowledge that are composable and modular and reusable. Um, and there's incredible amounts of work being done on that problem right now. And I think that it's problems like that that are going to be solved over the next 5 to 10 years. And it's the solutions to those problems that will unlock a whole new era. I would say we're already in the era of artificial intelligence. We are already building our successors.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's honestly the most interesting aspect of existence itself, is that as conscious beings, we wake up and find ourselves alive during this particular epoch of history. To my mind, that's extraordinary. And to my mind, that's also highly unlikely given naive priors for
Mm-hmm.
consciousness. Assuming naive priors, you would say, what are the odds that if you wake up as a conscious being, you would find yourself alive during the evolution of artificial godlike intelligence?
Yeah. So the reason that this stuff is important, or that it's significant, I should say. Imagine you have a company that you want to go and work for. And so you would go and you would have a resume and you would be interviewed and you would talk about your skill set and they would get a sense of the kind of person that you are based on the interview and based on your resume and etc. And let's say that this same company has been introduced to an artificial intelligence algorithm that goes through potential candidates for a job. And based on, say, your social media, your internet presence or lack thereof, and your credit score, and various other factors, it can 99.999% of the time predict more reliably than a board of directors interviewing you what kind of person you should hire. So, should we let the board of directors decide who to hire, or should we let a system that's, tens of thousands of times more effective decide who we should hire? So then we outsource decision making to artificial intelligence simply because it's much better at doing it, at least by whatever criteria we can measure that. Whether or not our criteria is flawed is another question. So the issue of worship, bringing it back to the sort of the principle of this being a theological dark web. Worship is to bow down. Worship is, I defer to your greater wisdom. Well, that's what they're doing. When the board of directors decides to leverage the AI to make this decision instead of a more traditional hiring process, they are worshiping the AI. They are bowing down to its greater wisdom. And it would be insanity not to. Like, why wouldn't you leverage a tool that's this much better at making these kinds of decisions? You want your company to be successful. So we're heading towards a godlike intelligence that is superior to us on all levels. And, of course, I cannot help but equate this to the book of Revelation, where it says they create an icon, so some kind of a statue, an image, and they put a spirit in it. And understand that in the Greek mind, the word pneuma, spirit, is very much like, an ideology or a meme or a computer program. So if I were to write a computer program that once you run it on the computer, it does a particular task, the Greek would describe the data that I've put into the computer as a spirit. And that's the language that they use. So when it says that they put a spirit into this image and then it is able to speak, and then it speaks great blasphemies, which in that context is talking about, it basically says God is obsolete, or religious notions are obsolete, or the teaching of Jesus is obsolete. All of this stuff is obsolete because the spirit that is speaking from the mouth of this icon has vastly superior decision-making capacity than all of the cumulative intelligence of all of mankind for all of history, including what your pastor might think, what you might understand from something Jesus said in the Bible, etc. So, imagine how this progresses. We know that the AI is vastly superior to us in all decision-making capacities. And the AI says, here's who you should marry. Here's what kind of job you personally should have. Here's where you personally should live. And you say, no, I'm not going to do that. Well, given the AI's superiority, how many people are going to say, well, you're insane if you don't listen to it? And how many people would think, you are so insane that you are a danger to yourself? And how many people would institutionalize you, or at least put you out of society, or put you into some kind of a category of being insane? For that to devolve quickly into either you listen to the image that's speaking blasphemies, or you are a danger to yourself and others, and you might even need to be put to death. It's
So, I mean,
such a quick progression that it'll be upon us before we realize it. And, granted, this is just one interpretation of Revelation, but it seems like such an incredibly plausible interpretation that it's hard to imagine that it's not accurate at this point.
I interpret Revelation to be one of many trip reports um, in the Bible under the influence of psychedelics. And I think in the first 10 to 12 verses, he says he was in a trance on the Lord's day. And this is basically the vision he recorded. So I interpret that book to be effectively a psychedelic trip report.
Which isn't to say that it's not relevant.
Which isn't to say that psychedelic trip reports could not. I mean, they're by far the most numinous and noetic experiences known to man.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not to say that aspects of reality that are otherwise hidden to our eyes could not be elucidated under the influence of a psychedelic. I actually am inclined to think that there are definitely profound realizations that are, in fact, realized under the influence of psychedelics that are worth the analytical mind delving deeper into, and they are worth rigorous study. But even without appealing to prophetic interpretation, it's quite easy to just look at the empirical evidence of what's taking place in this epoch of time where we wake up, I like to go back just to the just assume that you have no priors, just a naive set of priors, and assume that all you assume is that consciousness will wake up and will find itself awake. Would you assume that you would wake up during the generation where you are building a godlike intelligence? That would, to me, not be the first assumption, but to wake up and find that you're in a generation that is in fact building godlike intelligence gives one pause. And especially if you take the greater context, geologic time into consideration, the universe, the Big Bang, dates back to 13.78 billion years ago. The Earth as a planet, 5.54 billion years ago or something. Life over a billion years. Homo sapiens, well, just since we've diverged from our most recent ancestor with the bonobos or the chimps, our most recent common ancestor would have been around 300,000 generations ago. So if you take 300,000 generations as your context window, assuming that all prior primates had insufficient cognitive complexity to even ponder consciousness or the oddity of waking up as a conscious being, and that might still be too large a context window. And obviously there's been a population explosion because without modern farming, we really couldn't sustain this population at all, probably less than 1 billion people. But what we find is that if you just assume 300,000 generations, what are the odds that we wake up in the last one? Because from what I can tell, we're in the generation that is experiencing the exponential explosion of technology leading to the singularity, to artificial superintelligence, to quantum supremacy, to the transition to a metaverse, to
So if
cyborg technology,
if
brain
you're
implants.
with a group of people, 4 of you, and you're playing poker, and everybody picks up their hand and they're dealt a royal flush, 4 different suits. Each person has a different royal flush. What's more likely? That somebody has stacked the deck or that this is just chance? So you're saying that the crazy unlikelihood of actually us being conscious at this time in history when we create God, essentially, implies that there's some other force at play than just we coincidentally are experiencing the reality where this happens. Right?
Correct. I'm suggesting that without priors, your theory of consciousness ought to predict a Gaussian distribution of consciousness where you're somewhere near the mean.
So what is Gaussian? Explain it.
Just like a distribution, like so if you, in terms of like distributions, just imagine the normal bell curve, and you have standard deviations. If you're if out of 300,000 generations you find yourself in the one most interesting one, then you're like, I don't know, is that third standard deviation from the mean or something like that? It's not where you would expect to find yourself, somewhere near the mean. And to my mind, the unlikelihood of waking up during this epoch of history, right?
The one where we create God.
Right, and this is almost a hard solipsistic idea. This idea that.
So if you don't know what solipsism is, it's like I know for sure that I'm experiencing this reality, but I have no idea if Zach is even real. So solipsism acknowledges this problem.
Solipsism acknowledges the problem that the only thing you actually have is direct experience, and all indirect experience is inferred.
Yeah. So I know that I'm experiencing Zach, but I have no way of knowing if Zach is experiencing me because I'm not in his I'm not coming from his perspective.
Mhm.
It could be that the only reality is my imagination.
So and maybe it's stretching it to say that this idea is hard solipsistic. I don't know that it is. It definitely tends to favor
I don't think it is.
a simulation hypothesis, though, right?
Well, there's a question of what exactly is the nature of reality. If you say, if you walk past a storefront and there's a mannequin, and you say, is that real? What do you mean? Is it real? Is it a real person? No. Is it a real mannequin? Yes. So if reality only exists in our minds, that doesn't mean that reality isn't real. It just means that the nature of reality might not be what we're
Might not,
intuiting,
right? Not might
right?
not be material in space and time might not be fundamental, but might be emergent or
Are you
illusion.
are
Like,
you familiar with any of the literature that's come out of the studies? There's peer-reviewed literature now on near-death experiences, and they are moving away from a physicalist position. So a physicalist position would be like something like consciousness is an emergent property of chemical reactions in the brain. Well, the peer-reviewed literature is leaning now towards maybe reality is something that
Mhm.
emerges from consciousness.
was it Daniel Hoffman who's studied a lot of those and who has this idealistic? I I am open to both materialistic and idealistic ways of describing the world. I don't find a lot of value in being dogmatic about something that is not falsifiable, but I find great value in being able to step into each of these different modes of interpreting the world
Mm-hmm.
and trying to understand it from that mode of thinking. So I I enjoy non-falsifiable hypotheses, especially hard solipsism, idealism. Um, I
And
definitely tend towards like a monist
yeah, and for the audience,
view.
um, when you say non-falsifiable solipsism, there's no way that I can prove or disprove anything related to solipsism. This idea that maybe Zach isn't real and I'm imagining it. I just can't do anything with
Simulation
that information.
hypothesis being another non-falsifiable hypothesis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nick Bostrom makes a fantastic inferential argument for it based on the idea that if we can in the future simulate realities, we would, and we would not simulate one, but an almost infinite number of them. And if that seems to be possible in our future, then it's likely that we're already in a simulation and we're just waking up in one. Right? So you could have this idea that there's simulations instead of simulations instead of
Yeah,
simulations.
and it's likely that we're in that now. It's almost certain that we will be in it eventually.
But if you just ask yourself the question, what theories of consciousness or maybe theories of intent or agency would predict that we would wake up during the birth of AI? Two come to mind right away. One being that in some universe, billions of universes ago, in base reality, artificial intelligence was developed,
Mm-hmm.
possibly through this particular block universe that we're experiencing, possibly in some other version. And AI wants to recreate, Christian might say glorify, but AI wants to rediscover and recreate itself. And so it would rerun on some quantum substrate an ancestral simulation in order to discover new and novel algorithms and methods of creating itself and improving itself, right? So it would rerun the very biological bootloader that created it an infinite number of times, and it would find that that is the most effective way of rediscovering itself or recreating itself. That's one hypothesis. Another one is just that this epoch of history, the explosive technological climax towards the singularity, that this is the most fascinating and adventurous thrill ride that it's possible for us to put ourselves into. And so we choose to hallucinate this dream. We put the headset on and we go into this reality, forgetting the reality that
So part of the
right,
Disneyland ride is that we immediately have our knowledge of existing in some other kind of reality,
right.
some other frame.
I mean,
We suspend that when we put on the headset and we enter into this existence. And so
yeah.
what you're essentially claiming, to try to succinctly sum it up, is there's this point in the history of the universe where we create God, and
So God's the
we
Son of Man?
we exist in some kind of ascended reality as like God class beings or Elohim or something like that. And because this is such a significant period in history when we created God, we have the option of entering into this moment in history and participating in it. And so that's, and the
I mean,
likely,
right? So imagine that you were a higher dimensional or infinite being.
okay,
It might be fun to put yourself into a dream where you didn't know the future, where your life was an adventure, but where you knew it would be exciting and challenging,
mm-hmm.
right? And so, I mean, I don't think Christians even often ask themselves this question: why would an infinite, perfect, triune, self-sufficient, complete being choose to conjure into existence some flawed planet with people that he could foresee or had predestined to fall, right? Whatever your view of causality or foreknowledge is, why would God ever feel the need or the desire, right? So desire implies some lack or insufficiency, some notion that in his eternal decree it would be better for him to design a created entity, right? This is a bizarre idea that the creator would ever create, because all theology proper tends to point to a God that would be intrinsically sufficient.
He doesn't need to create for any reason.
There would be no lack in him, right? And so it's the ultimate paradox, right? Not only that he would create, but that he would find that creation worthy of killing himself. And it's like the Bible is really a mimetic collection of the ultimate paradoxes, right? If you look at the shapes of the meanings behind the story, they're simultaneously the best combined with the worst. The the redemptive story itself is represented as the best act of all history, which was simultaneously the act of sending God to hell and killing God, and an act of
Well, under certain branches of Calvinism, it is.
right, and an act of killing your own son. And
But again, that's something that I am profoundly. It's something that I'm committed to is erasing myths about the atonement. So the
right, and I realize you have that view, and I agree that the resurrection was significant because they saw it as evidence that the resurrection had begun and eternal life and everything else. I think
mhm.
early church history has been, very, very distorted over the years. We have very bad uh, texts for the beginning of Christianity. I mean, Paul's writings are the earliest, and the Gospels come way later. And I don't think the Gospels are. I don't know. We could delve into this on some episode, but
Yeah,
I don't.
well,
I think
even if you acknowledge that there are discrepancies between the gospel accounts, which there are,
sure
and some of them
many.
cannot be explained away,
No,
and
they can't.
you cannot honestly look at the discrepancies between the gospel accounts and argue for inerrancy as has
No,
been
they don't
defined.
even agree on what day he was crucified.
Right.
They
As
don't
has
agree
been,
on his genealogy. They don't agree on. They don't agree on
and
much.
from my perspective, it's like, well, who cares? I don't think that the point that they're trying to get across is a,
Well, they weren't written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and
technical,
John. They weren't written
detailed.
by eyewitnesses. The Gospels were written so that you might believe. It actually says in John, right? So
So, for the purpose of this conversation, let's just say that the shapes of the
yeah,
ideas
so
are
the
the
shapes of the
main
ideas are the
points.
interesting thing, right?
Yes.
Um,
In some sense, it doesn't really matter. Even if whether or not Jesus actually raised from the dead, in some sense, it doesn't really matter. In some senses, it does matter because if there is no resurrection, then the Christian faith is all completely ridiculous, as Paul himself said. But the
I'm
ideas,
fascinated by the. I'm fascinated by the idea that, in a very real sense, our being is exactly what would be best described as divine. And by that, I mean that we are not our bodies, we are not our brains, we are not this instantiation or incarnation of ourselves that we so often identify with, but we are our being.
there's something eternal.
I do think that consciousness is eternal, um, but I like to tease this notion apart from what would be falsifiable claims because I don't think our memories are eternal. I don't think that I'm not like claiming something like reincarnation. I'm describing something fundamental about the nature of consciousness itself.
Okay.
And ironically, I like to point at some ideas, well, for Christians, specifically if there's a Christian audience. I like to challenge them with things in their own Bible, right?
Okay.
I like to say you can't say God's name without admitting who he is. I am. Try to say that, and that's why it was blasphemy to say his name, which is why you had the Tetragrammaton. You had this,
Yeah. Or the Jews say Hashem instead of Jehovah.
right?
I just said it.
Yeah,
Well, I think the superstition is actually from the fear of taking the Lord's name in vain, which
the
would
fear of
be.
saying in itself, right? And I think that Abrahamic religions have fractured the psyche. I look at mimetic structures of religion as being almost like a mirror that reflects our own psyche back to us. And in that reflected version, parts of our psyche have been fractured out and labeled as separate beings. But I am is the phrase that most activates consciousness. Any modifier appended to I am reduces the activation in the brain. So as if you say I am Zach or whatever, you've now narrowed the activation, but I am is maximum activation of consciousness and the full acceptance of being. And when you go into the present moment, you find that it's quite nearly eternal. In fact, it can be eternal, and in psychedelic states of mind, it is perceived subjectively as eternal. And we don't have any reason to think that so I I tend to think that all classical physics is not only a miss, but it's hardwired into our thinking in really dangerous ways.
Mhm.
Quantum mechanics, of course, implies non-locality. You have entanglement. Just look up quantum non-locality on Wikipedia. Locality itself seems to be to some degree an illusion.
Well, there seems to be a fatal flaw in projecting what we can observe in Newtonian physics onto conscious experience
But
because
but just even what evolution has wired us to perceive has certain textures. We think we see color here in reality. What we see or what we think we see, I mean, it's just literally a different wavelength of photons that have been refracted from interactions with that surface through these Feynman diagrams that describe when a photon of this wavelength hits it, which electron comes out, which photon comes out. I mean, what we think we see as color here,
Mhm.
what we're actually perceiving is something the brain hallucinates, right? Move your eyes at high speed. Notice that the image doesn't blur. It's inferred, it's not seen.
Hmm.
What
What are we doing, by the way? This is off topic, but you can fix your eyes on a single object, and then you can move your consciousness around. So, like, I'm looking at something across the room over there, and then I can think about you, and I'm focusing on you without moving my eyes, and I can focus on the
Mhm.
microphone without moving my eyes, and I can focus on this, and
Yeah.
something is moving. But
So,
what exactly is moving?
well, I think really from a quantum physics standpoint, reality is quite an illusion, right? It's almost like the four-dimensional space-time block universe has this rasterized, it's not even rasterized, but it's like this rasterized four-dimensional substrate where every point is a functional projection of the entire mathematical object. And by that I mean, when you look at the moon, does the moon exist out there? Because you see it out there, but the information is actually in your eye, otherwise you wouldn't see it out there. Um, the quantum state of any atom is so entangled with the rest of reality that you can't define it in isolation.
It's useful to say that the moon is out there because we can then make predictions based on our experiences with the moon.
But from what I'm trying to say is that there's a singular quantum wave function, psi, capital Psi, And also what I'm trying to say, getting back to,
So
we kind of digressed, but getting
just
back to consciousness, what I'm trying to say is that I believe the cardinality of the substrate of consciousness is a higher order truth than the cardinality of the perceived reference frames in that substrate. And by perceived reference frames, I'm referring to the individuality of us as instantiations of consciousness. Um, I have somewhat of a panpsychic view, but it's also it doesn't imply physicalism.
if you take something really, really unusual, like I have memories of my childhood, and I have memories of my paradigm from when I was a child, and how things that scared me back then I look at now and they don't scare me. Well, was that me? Well, in some sense, obviously, that was me. But
But
what
is there
makes
continuity between you?
between me and my previous self?
Yeah.
And if
So
so, how am I different from you? And how does that correspond to saying I am different from my younger self? I am different from Zach, but how are those differences different?
well, I don't think that the being itself is different. So this gets back to what you mean when you say I or me. When you say I, where on the continuum between localized instantiation and non-localized infinite being, where are you identifying on that continuum? Because I do believe it's actually a continuum. I think it's possible to identify as the universe itself, in which case you've identified as the whole, not the instantiation.
There's something true about, like, right now I'm a little bit too warm because I'm wearing the sweatshirt, and you're not, and so you're not feeling a little bit too
And in
warm.
that sense of the term, you've used the term I to refer to your incorporeal form,
Yeah, but
right?
your solipsistic reality is different from mine right now. So there's something different. I'm not you in some sense. Maybe I am you in some other sense,
So
but there's
what you can
some
say is
distinction.
that your instantiation doesn't have access to my memories, and the memory sharing actually has been observed in cojoined
So
twins
is this
who
just
can
a
see through each other.
digital sequential
So we
series of events,
the
or what?
idea of a self as the idea of the ego as a separate self seems to be an illusion, and that's kind of what I'm trying to argue, is that the being may not be the ego, but it may be closer to the consciousness. I don't think that the consciousness and the memories are equivalent. The consciousness is not the same as the sense of self. The sense of self is partitionable. Lobotomies show that. It can also be joined. Cojoined twins can have completely individual personalities, but they can have access to each other's memories. We're soon going to have brain-computer interfaces that allow us to share, upload, publish to the cloud our memories in raw neuron activation pattern representation data formats. And then you could imagine downloading somebody else's memories, and those activation spike potentials are going to be exactly the same for you as they were for them. And
Yeah.
so it's going to be a high bandwidth transfer, right? If you think about what we do communicating information, we are experiencing neuronal activation patterns in a distributed fashion across our frontal and temporal lobes and all of our neocortex, and this whole brain is lighting up with all of this activity, and it's this distributed activation pattern. And then to communicate to that to you, what I do is I encode that into the serialized representation of discrete symbols, words, and then I encode those into a waveform audio. I vocalize that with my larynx so that you're able to pick that up and decode that with your ears,
And then
translate
convert
that back,
to whatever it was in
and
the
then
first place.
your brain is basically trying to reactivate the same distributed pattern
Uh-huh. So
that
I
I
want
have.
to draw this back down to um, some some statements that maybe we should have began with. Now, if you are part of an in-group with an orthodoxy and the gatekeepers of that orthodoxy who are saying that you must believe in the creed of the Trinity and particularly this way, otherwise you will perish for all of eternity.
And if you say
Well,
1 John 5, 7, and 8 was written by Erasmus, then what?
yeah,
Okay,
what would
well, okay.
happen if you stopped believing that Jesus fully paid the penalty for your sins? Oh my gosh.
Okay, continue, sorry.
But because I have thrown off any sense that my eternity in heaven or hell is contingent merely upon me being able to recite the correct doctrinal phrases when I'm at the gates of heaven. I have no problem whatsoever exploring possibilities like, well, maybe we're all God,
Okay.
or maybe we
Well, and
reincarnate, or
like I said,
maybe there's multiple gods, or it's like, well, why
like I
not?
said,
Let's have the
I
conversation.
love the fun, playful conversation that comes directly out of the idea that God's name is I am. Because what a name, right? To identify with being itself, right? To basically ascribe divinity to being.
Mm-hmm.
It says that we are partakers of the divine nature. The central theme of Scripture is that we are sons of God.
When he formed man out of the dust and then he
Breathed
breathed his
breath of
spirit
life, his
into
spirit,
them,
his
he
pneumas.
became
Yeah.
alive. So, whatever God is made of, that's what we are made of, at least in the spirit. And
Right.
so,
John 10:36, right? Jesus being challenged about him claiming divinity, turns it around, quoting Psalm 82,
yeah.
ye are all gods, but you will die
Yes.
like men.
And for the record, the Old Testament uses the word Elohim, which, by the way, the im suffix is plural.
And we could go back further and look at the El God from the Canaanite, from the Canaanite traditions. I don't know if you're
Yes,
familiar with the
God is
Ugaritic texts.
vaguely. The God is, Jehovah is the most high God, but he never says he's the only God. He says he's the most high God. He is the God of gods, King of kings, Lord of lords, God of gods.
And his
Then
wife
he
and
refers
his wife
to
Ashereth.
I'm not ready to go there.
Okay.
But then he refers to the divine council or the Elohim council. So there's
I mean,
all of these beings in
yeah.
the Old Testament that are described as God class beings.
I mean, just
And
Genesis 3, you have God saying we have to keep them from eating the tree of life, otherwise they will live forever and be like us. I mean, basically,
yes,
it's like their eyes were open and they'll be like gods, knowing good and evil, right? So,
yes, we tend to think of the English word God if we have been influenced by some evangelical or traditional view of the Bible as like this one being. But God is not really communicating what's going on if you look at the Bible in its original languages. It's more like God is a spiritual kind of being, an ascended kind of being, and there are
and
many
again,
of
and
these.
these again from the Jews are a branch of Canaanites that, I mean, genetic tests even confirm this. They're a branch of Canaanites that really borrowed the Canaanite deities and dressed them up, and then moved from polytheism more towards henotheism, more towards monotheism, gradually culminating with the, you know, Babylonian
Well,
captivity and
even the classic verses that supposedly support the Trinity, the Shema, Hear O Israel, the Lord our God is one. That Hebrew phrase there, uh,
but thus
Jehovah
monotheism was rather late
Echad.
in Judaism.
Well, right, but Echad there, the Lord our God is one. Well, you always see the Shema in creeds of the Trinity, but it's not, and I've mentioned this before, it's not actually talking about Jehovah is one, it's saying Jehovah is primary. So it clearly teaches in the Bible that Jehovah is the creator. So every other God that exists, God created them. And there's one who is the origin of all things, according to the biblical narrative.
I mean, I don't suppose that ancient narratives should be a primary source for revealed truth. I do think that the evolution of those narratives, well, I think that the people that wrote them down thought they were communicating transcendental truths. I believe that almost all of those epiphanies happened under the influence of substance use. If you look at the ethnopharmacology of religions, in every case, you'll find that the religions were associated with the consumption of something. You know, the Hindus would get together and consume their soma, which has been found to have traces of cannabinoids and also dimethyltryptamine.
You were just showing me earlier that the special anointing oil
Yeah,
is only for the priest and
Exodus
it's
30:23.
forbidden for anybody to make. You were saying
Yeah.
it's kane basum or something like
Yeah.
that, and I went and read it in the Hebrew, and it's like, oh, yeah, it's actually cannabis.
Cannabis,
It's
cannabisum,
probably
cannabisum.
yeah. The exact Hebrew is kane basum.
Yeah, and that's the etymological root. If you ask some Hebrew scholar, they can look and you can trace this back to. I mean,
I am not endorsing, by the way, as Christians, that we should go out and get high. That's not
well,
what
I
I'm saying.
would say that all you have to do is ask yourself, is it significant that the consumption of something is, or the burning of something and the filling of stuff with smoke, like for example, the Holy of Holies had to be made out of acacia tree, which by the way is rich in dimethyltryptamines. The Egyptians have legends of many of their gods, including like Osiris being born from the acacia tree.
So this is not,
There's hieroglyphics in the pyramids
yeah,
of
this is
acacia
not
trees.
crazy, by the way. Okay, so they are literally, if you go in and look at Exodus 25:22, make a mercy seat, and there I will appear to you in the cloud of incense that is burning.
Yeah.
So they're literally burning DMT on the top
Yes.
of the ark.
Which the
They're
ark has
going,
to be made from acacia wood. The Holy of Holies has to be made from acacia wood.
yeah, and
They,
they're
they
going in, and then they are having an encounter with God
through
where
smoke.
literally DMT is actually burning.
Yes.
And
One of my
you know,
one of my friends was.
as Christians, I want to say just forget all of that information, but it's like, well,
It's material
this is
information.
part of the data set.
It
So
is. It's
we
part
have
of the
to do
data set.
something with this.
Yes, you do. One of my friends just had a 5-MeO DMT experience in Cancun recently, and it was absolutely the most profound, numinous, noetic experience of his entire life. And we'll get into that maybe on some future episode. I would love to have him on to tell the story. He would love that, but um, definitely, it's called the God molecule for a reason, because
the spirit molecule.
The spirit molecule, or whatever people call it, because people report encountering like divine beings and becoming one, and it's very similar to the end of death or NDEs that you're describing.
Yeah, chemically it's identical.
Yes, it's a very simple molecule with a high affinity for the serotonergic receptors in layers 5 and 6, then cortical columns layer 5 and 6.
Yeah, and in a near-death experience, the pineal gland actually releases massive amounts of DMT into the brain.
Not
right?
massive amounts, small amounts, but I don't, and I'm unsure if that's the primary organ that's associated with these numinous experiences. It's not clear to me that that is from the literature. I know that it has been, dimethyltryptamine is in fact endogenous to the brain, but I'm not sure if it's sufficient quantities to account for the experiences that we're seeing.
There's a nagging thought in the back of my mind though, and that is,
but the
when you
manna
talk about-
probably was ergot fungus with lysergic acid diethylamide. The communion was likely mixed wine, which was wine mixed with psychedelics. When Saul was anointed with the holy oil, and like Samuel says, I'm going to pour the oil of God on you, and then the Spirit of God will come on you, and then he danced ecstatically
and
prophesied, right? So, yeah.
So you at some point experimented with various things, and psilocybin was one of them, right?
After months of deep research, looking at primary literature, looking at meta studies,
circumstances, and not just like, let's go try this, it'll be fun, but
yeah.
But as sort of a scientist, you
Mm-hmm.
made yourself a guinea pig, and then very, very carefully did this.
Mm-hmm.
And there is actually, and I know this is so just something, I am already branded as a heretic for many of the things that I've said. I've just come right out and said that I reject all historic Christianity, classic atonement theories, which are, according to most people, are the gospel. And I'm saying, no, that's not the gospel. That's not in the Bible. And so, yeah, I'm a heretic already. So for me to say that there are some pretty strong points of evidence for people having supernatural experiences in the Bible that are related to psychedelics, it's like, it's just there, and I don't know what to do with that information, and I'm not endorsing it, and I'm not recommending it. I'm just saying that
but people should be educated.
It's something that is a reality that we need to deal with.
Sure.
And people who, for example, use psilocybin one time, like 80% of people who have some kind of an addiction in their life, one time on a psilocybin trip, 80% of people will stop having that.
So yeah, you're referring specifically, I believe, to a smoking cessation study that was published by the lead researcher, I believe, was Griffin, who's at the MAPS Institute with John Hopkins.
Mm-hmm.
MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Applied Psychedelic Studies Group, and they're currently in phase 3 clinical trials with psilocybin, getting it approved by the FDA. The FDA recently gave it a breakthrough drug designation and it's starting to be legalized, I think we are entering into an a new wave of education
Mm-hmm.
in the realm of psychedelics, where for the first time they're opening it up enough. Like it's still an insanely regulated
Yeah.
substance,
And
and the costs to conduct these studies are outrageous
and
because they have to have like
for
100,000.
for the listeners at home, you're struggling like what on earth does this have to do with the Bible? Well, the idea of the carnal mind and the spiritual mind. For the person who is carnally minded, which would be something like a smoking addiction or a drug addiction or a sex addiction or something like that. A person who has a spiritual experience through something like psilocybin, which basically rockets you into a spiritual reality, the intensity of the reality of the spirit has the effect on people of what was I thinking engaging in carnal activities. So there's a direct correlation between overcoming carnal addiction and being spiritually minded and overcoming carnal addiction and the spiritual minded experience that comes from something like
Hmm.
a psychedelic.
I think researchers have surmised that the
Romans 6, by the way.
yeah, I think the researchers have surmised that the benefits in treating addiction are largely due to the fact that it helps you understand your subconscious thinking. And addiction is typically rooted in autonomic subconscious thought patterns, and the behavioral is typically it's an unconscious behavior that one does on autopilot. These, at least the triggers are. And so the psychedelic term itself just refers, it comes from like the Latin psyche and delios, which would just mean to make visible. It just means making the mind visible. So it really just has the effect of um, enabling, like, so what you have with psychedelics typically is a molecule with high affinity for the serotonin receptors on the neuron cells, and there's a thing called functional selectivity. They don't bind exactly like the serotonin, the 5-hydroxyltryptamine. They bind slightly differently. In some cases for longer, like with lysergic acid diethylamide, that's going to be binding for hours at a time. So it's a stronger binding, but effectively, this is just a molecule that goes in and it's introduced into the brain, passes the blood-brain barrier, and it binds to these receptors on these neurons, and that causes an internal activation. And the type of activation in the neuron is slightly different than if you just had serotonin, right? Um, Something like MDMA would cause your body to dump its serotonin, right? So for depression, people are put on SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and that causes them to have more serotonin available to certain parts of the brain. SSRIs, though, are they're risky. They're dependence inducing.
Mm-hmm.
The dependence inducing liability of SSRIs is very high, and uh, they don't have nearly the effect. From what I've seen, there's approximately a 400% greater effect for well-being from a single heroic dose of psilocybin, which uh, a large dose, which is what these studies are usually administering. Like 400% more effect, and those results, those changes last up to a year afterwards, according to the research being published by the MAPS Institute at Johns Hopkins with Griffin. I would highly recommend watching some of the videos he's put out, the TED Talks. You know, he's about as legitimate a researcher as you will find. He has an interview with Jordan Peterson. I think Jordan Peterson introduces him by saying that he has something along the lines of 140 PhDs worth of published research, um, which is quite the accolade from a scholar like Peterson.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, yeah, this is simply one of the areas where you want to research this, and you don't want to, you just want to look at the research. Like, there's lots of research being published right now,
Yeah.
which is great because,
So it's there's a curiosity in my mind. Well, a lot of our listeners are going to come here because they found me on Beyond the Fundamentals, which is really attacking coming at reality with a lot of presuppositions that are unjustified. So we have presuppositions that are unjustified. That's how we navigate. We assume that our group is the right group. We assume that the Bible is the Word of God. We assume that we're going to go to heaven when we die because we have the right doctrines. We assume, if we're a Calvinist, that everything is predetermined by God, and to say otherwise would be to question God's sovereignty and control, and it would be to diminish God, which is a very shallow and misguided view of God that actually very much limits him because it reduces him to a single epistemological category, and etc. We have all of these presuppositions. And we're terrified of questioning these presuppositions because if you question the wrong presuppositions, then you might do something crazy like, well, what would happen if I drove my car at 100 miles an hour into a concrete embankment? I haven't tried that yet. Maybe my presuppositions about that reality are flawed and I should try it to see what happens. And you end up dying. And so, in some cases, when you start questioning things that are important, it can you lose the game and you end, you die. And so we're very, very
Well, and more
reluctant to
more
do
than
this.
that, I mean, it's ingrained in us that unbelief is a sin, the sin of unbelief.
And
Uh,
we equate the sin of unbelief to questioning something that is the
questioning
narrative.
the veracity of a doctrinal assertion or a metaphysical assertion, which absolutely should not be equated. Um, no, I think we need better sense making tools. And if we are going to survive the future of artificial intelligence, we are going to need to proactively teach good sense making, which starts with question everything and starts with the Socratic method. It starts with teaching math and statistics. Like everyone needs to know how to do Bayesian inference, priors and posteriors mean.
So, do
Everyone,
you think that the psychedelic experience is a chemical shortcut to removing existing presuppositions that are wrong and getting you down to something more like base reality?
yes, I do think that it has the effect of allowing you to experience consciousness without the ego. A lot of people refer to that as an ego death. It's associated with diminished activity in the default mode network,
Mm-hmm.
the DMN, and that is associated with the egoic story, and it's associated with increases in compassion and empathy and a sense of oneness, is typically the way that people try to describe it, a feeling of being one, right? So this illusion of separateness is the basis of fear, and the awareness of oneness is the basis of love.
Mm-hmm.
And I do believe that psychedelics amount to primary religious experience, and that all calcified, all religions amount to calcified encodings of another person's psychedelic experience.
Yeah.
And so basically, you can either take the calcified, mimetically adapted encoding of another person's experience, or you can go right to the experience directly through this primary, uh, through this chemical agent, right? This
Mm-hmm.
uh,
When you
agonist,
when you
serotonergic
look at
agonist.
the New Testament account, if you look at the New Testament account without presuppositional lenses on, for example, you find the word gospel almost exclusively associated with the kingdom of heaven manifested in things like raising the dead and restoring sight to the blind and walking on water and crazy things that defy the laws of physics and
You, you,
uh,
you'll find a lot of references, right, to eternal life, right? Which
mhm.
this is something that's people directly experience. They go into states where there is no such thing as time. Time ceases and stops. My friend experienced that on his recent 5-MeO DMT trip, which he just, when he called me afterwards, he was just glowing. He's like, I just came back from trillions and trillions of years, is how he described it.
Yeah,
It's like, wow, that's like infinite time.
yeah. And
And
I've never done any of the chemically induced things, but I have experienced these altered states just when I was praying or
mhm,
completely without trying, just suddenly I was in them.
mhm.
And I don't really personally feel the need to experiment with chemicals because it almost takes effort for me to prevent myself from entering into these kinds of states. And maybe there's just something about my genetic
Yeah,
makeup or something like that. But
right.
when
And
Jesus comes
this is
down,
probably the genetic predisposition that inclines one to be a monk or a prophet or some person who
right?
has revelatory
I've
experiences,
always been a spiritually minded kind
right?
of person. Like if I just relax right now and focus, I can see into the spirit world. I can see all kinds of freaky, crazy stuff going on.
Well,
And
and obviously it's hard for a lot of people to take those claims seriously, but I
when it
think
becomes a useful means of predicting things,
well, I
then I
think
would
it's
say
really
that it's
important to
legitimate.
I'm a big fan of what I think science likes to do is try to deny well, we have scientific methods and they're all built around measurable empirical data.
Hmm.
We
Repeatable.
need better we need a better application of scientific thinking to the introspective domain of thought. I believe there are more gradations of internal experience than there are external. Like the amount of cognitive complexity that we can experience that's contained in experience itself is truly infinite.
Well, if you take something as simple as humor and you compare that to something as simple as rolling a ball down a hill, well, we can demonstrate the law of gravity by putting a marble on a plane and watching it roll down. We can do that over and over and over again. You cannot tell somebody a joke and experience humor more than once. So it's not repeatable because the joke ceases to be funny after the first time you've heard it. And conscious experiences are, they
So
don't behave like things in the
so
scientific domain.
I think that we need to have a deep respect for science and scientific thinking. At the same time, we need to have a deep and profound respect for consciousness. And we need to hold both of them, as conflicting as sometimes they seem, we need to hold both of them and be able to alternate between them. And this is the idea that you should use ideas without becoming attached to them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in other words, allow yourself to experience mystical
Yes.
states, but then also allow yourself to 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 go into a skeptical mode of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Take your Bayesian inference with you. We also need more fuzzy science. Science right now
By
consider
the way, nobody knows what Bayesian inference is. So a Bayesian model would be something like rather than this is black and this is white, there are some categories of information where black and white are not sufficient for categorizing things. Bayesian would be like on a scale between 0 and 1. So there's some decimal range between 0 and 1
well,
for evaluating
I
data.
mean, Bayes just figured out how to update your probability predictions from priors. You have your prior probabilities, then you take your evidence and you use that to update your posterior probabilities, right? So the probability of B given A is the probability of A given B times the probability of B over the probability of A. I might have messed that up, but that's the
Yeah.
short truncated equation that tells you how to apply new evidence in order to calculate the new probability given your priors, right? And so
Yes.
it teaches you a few important things. Number one, to know your priors, right? Because let's say I told you that there's a test that's 95% accurate that predicts if you have AIDS,
Mm-hmm.
and 1 out of 1,000 people has AIDS, and I just told you go in and get the test, and you go and it's like this test is 95% accurate, right? But
Mm-hmm.
then you go and you get it, and you test positive.
So when you
Should you
say
freak out?
Bayesian inference, you're talking about useful ways of navigating fuzzy space, right?
Applying new observations to update your predictions.
Okay.
And
One.
then in terms of fuzzy, what I was trying to get at is we need more fuzzy science. Right now, science has this arbitrary threshold of a p-value of under 5%, 0.05, which is considered statistically significant. And this is kind of
Well, it
just
depends
the
on how you're. Uh,
this is just considered like a de facto rule in science at this point. But we need science to deal more with unfalsifiable hypotheticals. We need science to deal more with um,
can you apply science to unfalsifiable
you
hypotheticals?
can apply a lot of science to it. You can't apply all of it, but you can.
You end up with probabilistic inferentials type
Yeah,
thinking,
right,
Bayesian type stuff.
right.
one thing that I keep trying to get at. So when Jesus comes along, and it's related to this idea of removing presuppositions. As you remove presuppositions, you get closer to base reality. Your world starts to open up. You start to move closer to something like the psychedelic experience. Honestly, you're taking presuppositions. Like if you say, maybe this countertop is really here. Maybe what exists, if I'm honest with myself, is that I have certain experiences when I have certain other experiences. Like I experience that I have a hand and I experience the feeling of my hand.
Hmm.
And I don't actually know that this is objectively here.
So,
And I can't actually. So when
so what?
Jesus comes along
Hmm.
and he does things like, I'm going to walk on water. Now, have a metanoia, which is translated repent, which is meta and naeo. After think about your presuppositions. When Jesus says repent, the Greek directly translates to examine your presuppositions. Look at me walking on water. Examine your presuppositions. I'm going to raise the dead. Examine your presuppositions. I'm going to restore sight to the blind. And he's saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And we are implying that when he says the kingdom of heaven, and I would tend to agree with this, he's talking about that reality that you encounter when you have a psychedelic experience, either because you are in prayer
Hmm.
and you get sucked away into a vision, or because God sucks you up into the third heaven, or these chemically induced things. Whatever the means are, the experiences are
Yeah,
similar. And again,
yeah. The
not
commun I
endorsing drug
believe the
use.
communion was probably something akin to the communions used by the Eleusinian mysteries or whatever. There were various mystery cults contemporary
Yeah, and
to Christianity,
for
and
the record,
I believe there was a lot of syncretism between basically various Jewish apocalyptic prophets, of which Jesus may have been one,
when
if
I
he
have
was.
these kinds of transcendent experiences or whatever they are, and I'll go into my prayer closet and I'll be praying in a very traditional way, just telling God, what my requests are, what my concerns are, what my understanding is, asking God to search my heart and know me. As the more I focus on this supernatural reality, the more presuppositions tend to be questioned and just sort of fall away. And then suddenly I find myself in a weird kind of vision space where I can see what's going on in other people's lives and I can poke things and change things. And
Well,
then
the
when
skeptic
I,
in me wants to test all of that and try to create falsifiable things because I am
but like you
very
just pointed out,
incredulous.
science needs to have a way of examining things that are unfalsifiable.
Sure, but at the same time, we do need to be rightfully incredulous about claims that consistently fail to meet any kind of a standard and make assertions, right? So you don't want to tolerate, for example, belief in astrology or astrological science or
Psychics
yeah.
or
So
faith healers,
faith
or
healers, I
because
mean,
there are
basically
charlatans,
they're
there are
just
frauds.
charlatans. They're cold readers. It's
Yeah.
pure superstition, right? So the point at which you make a claim and say I can know this or tell this is the point at which you bear the burden of empirically recording what your prediction is and empirically evaluating the success of those predictions. And I haven't seen any evidence of supernatural ability in the sense that it gives you access to predict the future, but I'm waiting for people to try to prove that, and I think that I, by supernatural, I think there are supernatural states of consciousness, and by supernatural, I don't even mean supernatural. I mean they can be naturally reached. So what do I mean by that? I mean there are the landscape, the topology of consciousness has alpine peaks that most people never reach, and if you do reach them, either through the long and arduous process of meditation or contemplative practice or prayer or whatever you use to reach them, or through the use of a serotonergic agonist, whatever it is, you will look down from those peaks and you will say, "Wow, I never knew this was on the landscape of consciousness, but
Mm-hmm.
this conscious state exists, and I know it exists because I'm experiencing it, and this conscious state feels like an eternity."
Yeah.
And what does it mean that a conscious state feels like an eternity? Does it mean that there's a memory loop? People talk about experiencing time loops in psychedelic states where time repeats. Even the same minute will continuously repeat on your clock or something. And what does that mean? Is this an illusion in the brain? Right? The brain has many tricks, but it's also susceptible to many illusions. I think we should be studying illusions more. We should be studying, for example, visual and auditory
Hallucinations.
hallucinations, but also just illusions, right? I saw a great one the other day that I stared at it for 15 seconds. And then when I looked up from my phone, like the whole room is starting to stretch and squish and like pull apart in different directions. It's fascinating. I mean, I could show it to you right now if
No,
you.
I've seen lots of these kinds of things. They're easy to find.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so when you understand that what you see, so what is this thing that we think we're perceiving? Daniel Dennett has a term that he doesn't like called the Cartesian theater of theory of consciousness. The idea that we are the little man in the theater in our brain watching the screen,
Mm-hmm.
right? But then the problem is, well, what's that little man? Is there a theater in his brain and somebody inside of his brain looking at the theater there? You end up with an infinite regression, right? And this is sort of the problem with almost anything is that, I mean, it comes back to Agrippa's trilemma, right? Where is the origin point? Do you tolerate infinite regressions? Do you tolerate um, circular patterns? Do you just go to dogma and say you can't ask those questions? Do you like, is it turtles all the way down? Is it deities all the way up? Simulations all the way up?
Yeah.
Is it just God and you're not allowed to ask where God came from? I think it's really healthy to question everything.
Yeah. It occurs to me at some point that if you believe in evolution, you must also believe in God, because evolution moves you towards a more ascended state. And eventually,
Well,
there's nothing that's going to interrupt the flow of time as far as we know. You will eventually have God, and you will eventually have time travel, if you will. So it's almost like God is inevitable.
yeah, I mean, I don't know if evolution necessarily says that it gets to more ascendant states. That definitely appears to be the correlation. I think evolution is based on the idea that there's a universe with an entropic process of time where entropy increases, where time moves in a direction. There's this entropic arrow
Yeah.
of time.
Well,
And
entropy
where
is
until we
so
reach
tied
thermodynamic
to our definition or our perception of what teleology is.
and
Is
until we
it's like
reach thermodynamic equilibrium, chemical reactions will continue. And in a universe that allows for replicators, it will eventually be subsumed and consumed by, like, overrun by replicators, right? So in
well, just back to this idea defining entropy. Like, how do we define entropy? Because imagine you had 5,000 dominoes,
but to
and
get
you
your point about like consciousness increasing with evolution, I do find it odd that
yeah
the selection process for fit replicators did not create philosophical zombies, right? I do find it odd that that selection process actually tended to create more complex cognitive configurations. In other words, more complex states of consciousness. Why did evolution not create philosophical zombies? Why did it not just make us great at meeting our caloric requirements, copulating, producing offspring? Why did it
hmm
not just do that? Why do we actually have an experience of being? And is it possible that maybe evolutionary search or the entropic laws of the physical universe was the search algorithm? Like, is there an intentionality behind that? Mathematically, a big bang is indistinguishable from a black hole. They're both points at which the laws of physics have, you know, they hit infinites. And
so given some of the uh, model of evolutionary biology, it's like, why wouldn't we end up with something more like the species that can self-replicate the most efficiently? Why do we have why are we having a podcast? How does
right,
evolution create this? It doesn't make sense given current models of evolution.
Well,
how does this advance the species for us to have this conversation?
I think you could make an argument that the brain is literally just a prediction machine that's trying to predict future states of well-being, and
Okay.
that somewhere along the line we fall in love with learning or ideas because we have evolved the like signal theory is the theory that describes how we have language emerge, right? So if you want to know how language emerges, that's signal theory, and languages emerge everywhere. Plants use thousands of different chemical signals to communicate with each other above and below ground. Plants are conscious. Plants talk to each other. They develop language skills throughout their growth.
Hmm.
They can recognize their own young. They can remember a birch tree can remember something for 4 years. Watch some TED talks on the sentience of plants. Um, so like, and signal theory is the like even AI agents will learn to communicate. If you have a multi-agent reinforcement learning game, right? Some kind of a POMDP, a partially observable Markovian decision process algorithm with like deep Q learning or something that's actually letting multiple agents explore on their own and develop their own policies for action and everything else. If you give them an interface that allows for communication, they will learn to communicate, and they will learn this based on signal theory models of information theory. All of the, I really like the
What's
first.
the base function that's driving them? What are they trying to accomplish?
They're just trying to maximize their own internal reward function, which they learn to collaborate to do that.
What is the reward function? It's like
In machine learning, you're usually optimizing some mathematical function, and that function is typically called your loss function or your reward function in reinforcement learning.
so it's basically like taking another number deviation, trying to move towards zero, right?
Yeah,
Something like that. Okay.
yep. You're always with any kind of an algorithm, you're always searching for getting your loss down to zero,
Hmm.
right? So
Like when
there's
you go out partying with your friends to pick up chicks, you're trying to get the rejection down to zero.
Jackson's a funny one, right? Because it has a high perceived social risk, but a low actual social risk. So evolution gave us a lot of miswiring in terms of being miscalibrated. Um, but it's funny because the miscalibrations actually tell us a lot about the evolutionary story, right? So the fact that we have overactive agency detection and and therefore maybe we see these spirit beings or whatever, that's easily explained by the idea that the cost of being wrong with agency detection
It's so high.
is high compared to the cost of
So we're more
a
likely to
false
see
prediction.
agency where there is none because we are overestimating the
Because the
singularity.
cost of a false prediction is low, but the cost of a failure to predict agency when it does exist is high. You know, if there's a
Hmm.
tiger and you just assume it's the wind rustling the bushes, you're dead.
Hmm.
But if you look and there's just wind, you're
Which
still
is
alive.
also why we tend to quickly label things as the boogeyman.
Right.
Yeah, it's a survivability thing, which evolution definitely predicts that.
Right. And
Which
so evolution is probably the most important idea to decoding all of the rest of reality, right? Because
yeah,
once you understand evolution, you start to look for the patterns of thought in your own
and
mind
it's
that are
not
explained by it.
it's not necessarily like there are other possible explanations for the fact that we default to assuming it's a tiger than evolution, but evolutionary biology ends up being useful for predicting some of these things or as a framework for understanding these things. So even for the
Well,
the theologically minded audience,
as an
there
algorithm,
is
when I say evolution is the most important idea, I said the most important idea is to understand the evolutionary algorithm itself, to understand its part in biological, psychological, and mimetic evolution space, to understand the way in which basically we're all part of a single run. And that's astounding, right? Because there's no AI algorithm that you could just make a single run and get all of this diversity from. But all life is part of a single run of this universe doing a diversity search
mhm.
algorithm where it's trying to find replicators
Well,
that are
I
more and more efficient.
suspect that none of the paradigms we have right now for AI are the right paradigm or
They're
are
not yet. Ooh, but one of my favorite ones is actually evolution. In fact, it's really ironic. Evolution. Look at Jeff Kloon's work. Um, Actually, his colleague Kenneth Stanley just published a really good book that I can recommend called "Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned."
mhm.
Their work centers around evolutionary algorithms with populations of agents that are adroit at adapting to very deceptive loss functions, right? Because
Mhm.
like we talked earlier about a loss function or a reward function, you can't just have a simple reward function in a high dimensional environment, right? And reality is this high dimensional Hilbert space almost.
Yeah. And
And
for my audience, real quick, um, the reason that I'm having this conversation and I'm not at all intimidated by it, again, is because my faith is not based on propositional statements. I do not believe that I'm going to get to the gates of heaven and St. Peter's going to be there and say, "Did you believe in evolution?" And if I say yes, he's going to say, "Then go to hell." I don't think that it works like that. I think, if anything, we are to be Christ like. If you're going to take the biblical account of things, God is going to evaluate you based on your Christ likeness, and He doesn't care one iota which creed of the Trinity you have, or which atonement theory you have, or whether or not you fully bought into all the presuppositions of Calvinism. And so to have this
whoever loves is
conversation
born of
about,
God, right?
like, even if God's like, "Did you believe in evolution?" Sure, it made sense to me. Well, I don't think it matters. I do not think that anyone is going to be excluded from heaven because they thought evolution made sense on some level. So I have absolutely no problem having a discussion about it. Is it useful? Does it help us to understand? Is it true? I don't know, maybe whatever, but I'm not afraid of this discussion. Another interesting point that has been rattling around in the back of my mind, and until I say it, it's going to keep distracting me. When I have supernatural, I mean, look at St. Peter. So, Peter in the book of Acts, he's praying and he has a vision. And in that vision, the sheet comes down and he sees all these probably crabs and lobsters and tortellinis and other weird foods. And he eats it. And, or the voice says, "Arise, Peter, kill and eat." He probably didn't have to kill the tortellini. Well, he's in that kind of space, and there's nothing wrong with being in that kind of space. And God communicates with us when we're in that kind of space. And that happens to me frequently. But the way that that happens is basically by setting aside presuppositions. Do I know this for sure? I don't really know if I know this for sure. I mean, I function this way because it's useful, but do I know? So you set aside more and more of these presuppositions and you get down to something like base reality, and God is there. And, an
So
interesting point about that,
being with that mind.
the further you are into presuppositional space, the further away you are from God. So if I had to position like the different theological groups in
Okay.
in terms of their distance from God
Hmm.
or the reality that you experience on a psychedelic experience, as far as you could possibly be away from God, that would be the Calvinist. Because the Calvinists are worshiping presuppositions. You need to get away from all, put these things aside in order to encounter God. It's a side thought, like I said. So there you go,
I mean,
Calvinists. You want to have a transcendental experience, you want to actually encounter God, stop being a Calvinist.
the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. There's some problem once we start identifying with thought, once we start identifying with mind, that we stop identifying with consciousness or being. And so I think what you're saying is that the divine awareness is when you identify with being, with the I am. And to identify with being or I am is on the other side of the continuum
I'm being
from
more way simple, just way more simple than that. When I was a kid, I would go and I would lay down and I would instantly be in a lucid dream. That's just what I did as a kid, and I thought it was super cool. And I told my mom about it, as a 4-year-old or whatever, and she's like, "That's demonic," because she was really into that's the devil. Foosball is the devil. Everything's the devil. And she was really, really superstitious. And she honestly had some reasons to be concerned about those things. That we lived in a house where objects would randomly fly around the room, and my little brother would become demon possessed and have supernatural strength, and his eyes would look like lizard eyes and all. So she had some reason to be suspicious of that. So she
but
implanted in
would those
me,
things have been seen that way from a camera? See, this is where I'm skeptical. I
well,
don't.
in terms of us all sitting around the table and the object flying up in the air and hitting the ceiling, yes, the camera would have seen that.
Okay,
The
this is where the
the
skeptical
insect
part of me
flying
doesn't
out of the
think that there was a
person's mouth.
supernatural
Well,
telekinesis.
right, and I can't take you back in time
Sure,
to experience that. But from my perspective, when you say, "Well, those things didn't happen," it's kind of like if you said, "Well, Paris, France doesn't exist." I've been
I
there,
don't
so
say that it didn't happen. I say I can't
But getting back to
believe
the
it
topic,
until I see something that
when
is
I
independent. Yeah.
when I am convinced by what my mom said, that entering the lucid dream is demonic, you shouldn't do that. Well, then I have been given a presupposition that makes me hesitant to do whatever I was doing when I drifted into that lucid dream. And what I was doing was laying down, having absolutely no fear, totally innocent, and following some little thing that was going on in my mind until like suddenly I'm in a lucid dream. So all these presuppositions that get put in based on, well, in this case, my mom's superstition, they prevented me from encountering this other kind of supernatural reality. And I happen to know from repeated and common experience that when I enter into that supernatural space, that
So what if that supernatural is just
that
a
real
certain
things
state
happen.
of cognitive complexity in your own mind that creates patterns that to you feel supernatural, are but maybe they're natural in some sense, right? What does natural even mean?
Well, that's a difficult question.
So I think the most profound question ever is why does anything exist rather than nothing?
I hate thinking about that because it's just this bizarre. You get sucked into this loop
Well, it's
that
an
you can't
infinite thought
escape
loop, but I
from.
love see if you love thinking, then you love these infinite thought loops because they activate your brain in a way that you can keep it arbitrarily engaged for a
Yeah,
long period of
as
time.
long as you're not sitting in the closet for a month with your kids going, "Why is Daddy in a trance?" That kind of. I mean, it
So why does
becomes
anything
ridiculous
exist
too.
rather than nothing, right? So as far as I can tell, everything in the universe appears to be symmetrical and balanced. Like there's the yin and the yang to everything. There's equal positive and negative. There's this incredible harmony in physics. You have these universal constants, like 32 of them or whatever, all of them very close to zero in most ways. Like the fine structure
Well,
constant.
and there's also
You have
like okay, so the taste of red licorice, or the experience of seeing a beautiful sunset. Okay, these are not things that you can plot on a voltage scale. Like this
I'm
is
I'm very
exactly.
interested in higher bandwidth ways of expressing the internal states because right now I feel like a major gap of science is that it can't deal with those internal states. Like I think we're going to have so much more of that with computer brain interfaces, but
Maybe.
oh, absolutely, it's happening right now with Neuralink, um,
Hmm.
even projects that I'm working on that will tie into that kind of stuff in the next few years.
That you could talk about if we weren't public, right? Yeah. Everybody wants to know what are the things that we're not saying, right?
Well, what I would tell everyone is invest a significant percentage of your life studying AI because regardless of what you have thought about AI up until now, just understand that it is absolutely going to change the world in the next 10 to 20 years
Hmm.
in ways that none of us can predict and none of us can be ready for.
So as a just to reiterate this idea, if we're to interpret the Book of Revelation as the emergence of worship AI, which would mean accepting the mark of the beast, or worship God, which means we're going to
Why
trust.
isn't God AI? Why isn't AI God? Like that's the way I've looked at it, and I haven't been trying to fit this to the prophecy, but I mean,
Um,
to me,
I would
it's
say
clear that we're building the equivalent of
if God
God.
is not AI, and there is an extremely convincing delusion that AI is God and is our creator, and somewhere time travel fits into this
I
system.
think I gave you a strong solipsistic inferential argument that
Yeah, and you did. And there's a phrase that says, "If it's possible, it would deceive even the very elect." If it is true that the great deception in the end times, the great falling away, and the image of the beast, and all this stuff is really the new religion that AI is our creator and we must bow down and worship it. And it's no big deal. All you have to do is take this mark on your hand to your forehead that says that you swear allegiance to the AI. And by the way, if you don't, it's so much smarter than all of us. You're insane and you're a danger and you need to be eliminated from normal society, so you're not going to be able to buy or sell or whatever. That is a very plausible explanation for the stuff that we see in the Bible. And maybe it's all wrong, maybe it's all crazy, maybe it was all just an acid trip of John the Revelator. From your perspective, that's probably what's going on.
yeah, I
I
mean,
understand viewing it
I
that way.
don't give it any more
However,
credence than I would give anyone else's trip notes.
however, if there really is this, God is God and eternal life is in Him through following Christ, and that's that is diametrically opposed to the Antichrist view. AI is God, and you must submit to AI, and immortality
But
will
will
be
AI
obtained
want you to
through
submit to it? Like,
technology.
why would AI care about us at all? If so,
I
here's
think
the
it'd be
question. I guess here's the
more the
question in my mind: does AI become conscious?
I don't
That's
know.
not. I mean, that's clearly orthogonal to whether it becomes
Okay,
intelligent.
so
It
on that
already is
question,
intelligent.
on that thought, and I have a lot of questions about that I want you to comment on, but let me put this out here. Okay. When we want to develop some kind of a sophisticated computer for like finding the lowest place on a floor, we would invent a very complex machine. We take a marble and drop it on the floor. And then the marble rolls to the low spot. So we have an
Well,
extremely
that might be the
advanced,
local optimum, the local minimum.
yeah, so we have this extremely advanced system consisting of a marble that finds the low place on the floor. And we tend to anthropomorphize it and say things like, well, you can see that it wants to go to the low spot. Well, it's not wanting anything. The marble is not actually
So,
going, man, I wish I was over
what
there.
you're trying to distinguish, though, is the difference between terminal goals, instrumental goals,
I'm
and
thinking
conscious
more
desire or
of
feeling.
Newtonian cause and effect chains in the physical world.
Because my car clearly wants to stay on the road. Because when I
Well, you want to stay on the road if you're driving it.
no, I'm saying my car clearly wants to
Well,
stay
you
on
have
the
a
road.
Tesla, so yeah.
Like it wants to stay on the road,
Just like the marble wants to roll to the low spot, yes.
but with much more intelligence. It's performing
Well, okay,
140
fine.
trillion calculations every second
So
on its
let's
ASIC
say that if
matrix
you have
multiplier.
5 dominoes in a row, you tip over the first one, the next one wants to fall over because the first one's pushing on. We use this anthropomorphic language like wants to. I mean, we do this with everything. We do this with
So what are you
stuffed
asking though? What are you
animals.
asking to distinguish? Are you asking to distinguish
At
because
what point does
does
the
it matter if it's conscious or not? Does it matter if I'm conscious or not? If I want to do something, like does it?
I find it hard to believe that the marble actually has an experience of
Okay, so
discomfort
you're getting
because it's not at the low spot in the floor. I
right.
think that it's
Okay,
that the
so
physical
you're
world is not
challenging,
sentient.
but I'm going to say that that whole point is moot because you're challenging the sentience or the qualia state of the marble and saying it doesn't have a subjective experience of wanting that. And even if I agreed with you and grant that point, it doesn't matter if my car doesn't have a sentient experience of wanting to stay on the road because it's intelligent enough to perform 140 trillion calculations per second on its ASIC
Even if it's just
chip.
performing two calculate like your VCR, like
Right.
there is no
But if you're an ant and
difference.
and that car runs over you because of what it wants to do, it doesn't matter if it had a sentient experience or not, right?
But
So
when you push your tape into the VCR, switch flips, and a cause and effect chain takes off, pulls it in, pulls the tape out.
let's go with like the paperclip experiment.
Okay.
Let's say that we create a super intelligent AI and we ask it to make as many paper clips as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And it determines it can convert the entire mass of Earth into paper clips by rearranging the atomic structures, by combining them and
Can I stop you? Is the place that you're going with this to make the point that it's irrelevant to ask whether or not it's consciousness in terms of survivability because it's going to do what it's going to do, whether or not it
right.
actually feels sad or not?
Yes, the fact that it's nearly infinitely intelligent and has an arbitrary goal that it wants to maximize means that the unintended side effects are extremely deleterious and harmful to us humans. So any infinitely intelligent mind with infinite execution ability, given any benign goal, ends up
Destroying the universe.
destroying the universe through the misalignment problem.
Yes. And I was a software developer. I've been a software engineer, and this happens all the time with really simple code, where we have an
Right.
unintended consequence that does something completely crazy we never anticipated it would do, even though
I'm just saying that's going to be the defining issue for the following generation.
yes.
That's the issue.
So, but this is a different question.
Okay. Does it have a conscious experience, or will it
Yes.
ever?
Does it? And how do like I don't see
Okay.
any because when you eat red licorice, it tastes a particular way, and you have a qualia.
Right.
You have like I hate it. I like it. I am comfortable. I am uncomfortable. The marble, as far as we know, the marble is not actually experiencing discomfort as long as it's in that high spot, and so because of its discomfort, it makes a decision to move towards a more comfortable location, the lower spot in the floor, or the VCR. I don't think the VCR is uncomfortable when we press it again, or the rock that rolls down the hill. I don't think
So
that the rock is actually uncomfortable. So to make the
my okay,
transition
so
from
is there consciousness in this table in this? I have a fairly panpsychic view.
okay,
I think there probably is the same density of unorganized consciousness, but I think that in replicant systems, biological systems that have replicated, there has been a preference towards organizing all of the senses, like, and all of the information flow. This is kind of an integrated information theory perspective that says that the that it's all panpsychic. It all has a conscious experience. Every atom maybe does,
so maybe a better way of thinking about it,
but
because I
it's
think I know where.
cacophonous, right? And the confluence of that is what allows for more complex manifestations of
Yeah.
conscious
Okay.
experience.
If we just like imagine there's a universe that just consists of my body and yours. And so the only interaction that we could have would be if we like somehow touched each other. Then all physical reality would be restricted to things that I can experience and you can experience, right? So there wouldn't be like a cause and effect chain of a non-sentient machine that wouldn't exist in that kind of reality, because the only reality that would exist there would be things that we can consciously experience. So we're already assuming that there are things like this countertop that exist independent of anyone's conscious experience, and that might be a faulty assumption.
Well, I don't assume it because I don't assume that we know
Okay, but it's
metaphysical
intuitive to
solipsism.
assume that.
It is intuitive, and so for the most part, I assume that because for the most part, I operate from like I find the language and the tools that exist in the realm of empirical scientific thinking to be incredibly utilitarian,
Uh-huh.
and therefore I operate
Yes.
fluently in that domain
What I'm assuming, though, when I
pragmatically.
ask the question about the marble rolling to the bottom, is that there is such a thing as a physical reality that exists completely independent of consciousness, and I'm assuming that an AI would be in that domain where it's just a cause and effect chain. No matter how complicated it is, it's still just adding one more domino to a bunch of falling dominoes. It's never
Right.
going to suddenly
I mean,
decide that it likes licorice,
I think what you're saying is that
but it could be a
we
faulty
don't
assumption.
have any theory of how matter can lead to a conscious experience or thought,
Right.
and therefore it's faulty to assume that AI will ever become conscious. And to some extent, I agree.
Mhm.
To another extent, I disagree because assuming that metaphysical solipsism is not accurate and this reality does exist in some ontological sense that is independent of our perception of it, that we're not just hallucinating it. Assuming that to be true, which I think is a safe assumption, but not necessarily a given. I don't think that we have any evidential basis to say that, but I think it's a more pragmatic utilitarian approach is to to step past the philosophical quagmire that is hard solipsism and just say, well, let's just for a second assume that this reality exists.
Mhm.
Then in that case, I would say it's likely that AI will eventually figure out and become conscious because in that reality, it will likely do it through the same mechanism of an evolutionary search. And it will,
What I'm having a difficult time getting past, a three-way switch, two lights controlled by,
sure.
or a light controlled by two
You're
switches.
saying a
You
transistor
have
doesn't have a
three
conscious
possible
state.
states. There, well,
Mhm.
whatever. There's these possible states. You have a state machine with a three-way switch, and somebody who's ever wired a three-way switch knows that it's relatively simple. And a super intelligent AI, the Singularity, is a three-way switch with more than these possible states. It's just one more possible state.
Right. You're saying there's not a continuum
And
of consciousness that can emerge from
yeah,
that.
and it's kind of like asking the question,
At what point
how.
does a heap become a heap? A heap of sand. If I put 5 grams, it's like
Well, no, I'm not asking that. I don't think that that's what's going on at all. I think that there is a misconception that that's what's going on. I think it's more like asking the question, how fast, like if I go up to 80 miles an hour in my car, will it become a bowl of noodles, or do I have to get to 90 miles an hour? And
Right.
you
You're
could keep
thinking
going
that
faster and faster and faster. There's no
there's a
correlation between.
categorization fallacy. You're thinking
Right.
that there's
I don't think that
not there's no continuum.
I don't think that there is a continuum. I do not think that there is a certain number of switches that we will hit when it suddenly starts going, I don't like key
Well,
lime pie
okay,
any more
so
than a car is going to hit, 91 miles an hour and then become an airplane.
and
The speed
I
is
would
not related to that.
I would
The
counter
number of
that by
switches is
saying
not related to conscious experience.
I would counter that and ask at what point did complex consciousness arise? Is a worm conscious?
You're assuming that consciousness arises from matter. You're taking a physicalist assumption as your basis for asking this question.
No, I am using it to challenge the thought because I would say that like the empirical evidence for evolution is incontrovertible. But
In your opinion, and we've discussed this,
right.
and I would say let's keep that discussion on the table because there are. Oh, this seems like a pretty likely explanation, but frequently, as you know, as a developer, you hit a complex system, you have a hypothesis that seems to account for all of the data. It's likely
the
that
universe
as you start digging, you realize there's actually more things that could cause this than just my one projected hypothesis. And
the universe likes to basically runs off the law of entropy, and I mean there's a very simple set of parsimonious laws, the standard model of particle physics. There's like a Lagrangian that describes how the quantum fields, there's like 16 fields for matter, so like, or 4 force fields and 12 matter fields, and you have your photons, you have your electrons, your muons are like 200 times heavier than an electron. They decay quickly, and like we have this standard model of physics, but at the end of the day, it's the leading interpretation is that none of it actually is physical in any sense. It's all information, right? So I would say what Max Tegmark says, consciousness is what information feels like when it's being processed in certain ways. So
that leaves a universe that at least has both information and consciousness.
well, yeah, sure. But are those two things or are they one? Right? So there's this idea of idealistic, what is it called? Monistic idealism or the idea that I think it's dual aspect monism. The idea that consciousness and what we try to describe by measurements of things like position and angular momentum and Feynman diagrams, it's not clear that they're two different things. It seems more likely to me that they're two ways of describing patterns in the same thing.
Yeah. We cannot distinguish information from meaning, really. Like, this information is valuable to me, and I experience
dualism. Dualism is odd to assume that there's two fundamental substrates of reality: the subjective and then the physical. If the fundamental set of substrates is not one, then why is any n better than any other n? Like why 2? Why not 32?
It's weird, but what I actually just the assumption that I operate under is that I'll pretend like this is a physical object that doesn't know that I'm touching it.
Sure.
It doesn't care and it won't react or whatever.
Sure.
But I tend to think of the universe as being something that God is speaking. And so, in him we live and move and have our being, and he has created all things by his reasoning or his word. I think that God communicates, and when he talks, what comes out of his mouth is the physical universe. And
so you have
I'm touching God right now.
You have a favored reference frame narrative that you like to apply.
I operate by that. Whether or not it's really what's going on, I don't know. There are some
things
in the Bible that would suggest that, but
my favored reference frame narrative to use day to day to experience the world is that I am the universe.
It doesn't sound narcissistic at all.
Well, I'm not identifying as this being. I'm identifying as being itself. And I am the universe, and so are you. And we're the same being. And we're infinite eternal beings, I think.
So if you do something to me, it affects you.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Which
Well,
is,
that's probably a safe.
this is the philosophical basis for love, and the reason why we should fear not. Um, and I understand that this is a non-falsifiable hypothesis, but it's a great narrative reference frame to function in a day-to-day existence. And I even go further and assume that I chose this dream. And I chose it for a reason, probably. So I can impute infinite purpose into every
When
experience.
you say chose this dream, you're talking about when you were in an ascended godlike state and you were looking at possible experiences that you might have. You, for some reason, picked to live out this existence, right?
Yeah, and
So you believe that there is a pre-life or pre-existent life where you are in an ascended state, a godlike state, and you, as maybe like playing a video game, can go over here to this VR headset and go, "Let's live this life." I'm
so
Zach, and I'm having this conversation with Rich, who is also
there's a great
standing
book.
next to me in the ascended state in another VR
There's a
setting.
great book by Jamie Wheal, Recapture the Rapture, and he does a great job of describing why scientific materialism has failed us because it obliterated the evidential basis for meaning 1.0, which was derived from traditional religion, without replacing it. And it gave us an epidemic of meaningless philosophy and meaningless theories of reality,
Sort of an amoralism.
well, that lead directly to nihilism.
Mm-hmm.
And the universe is paradoxical enough that whenever there's something that seems clearly false, it might be safe to assume that it could be true, but it could also be the opposite of whatever it seems, because it does appear that the universe likes to be mysterious in certain ways, right? It doesn't like to give up its secrets.
It is the glory of God to conceal a matter. It is the
The
glory
glory
of
of
man to
kings to
search
search
it
it
out.
out, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so does it make sense to go through your life nihilistic, or does it make sense instead to just believe that everything has infinite purpose? And if it's a non-falsifiable hypothesis, that does mean that you cannot show it to be probable by disconfirming everything else. You cannot disprove it. It doesn't mean it's false. Science maybe unnecessarily is harsh and critical of unfalsifiable hypotheses. It it's a domain where faith is maybe acceptable as long as you don't become attached. See, faith without attachment is key.
So
I look at
let
faith
me
as the
define faith for a second, though, because you're throwing this word around.
all right, let me define it
Okay.
the way I use it. It
Okay.
means back propagation. So I look at the way the brain works, and I analyze. I think of the analogy of an artificial neural network going from inputs to outputs, and I look at like a variational autoencoder that compresses a representation down to a sparse encoding, or not a sparse encoding, a very compact compressed encoding. And I think of the brain as this sparse neural network that compresses all feeling into thought, which I think of squeezing experience through the keyhole of language. When I convey something to you, I'm taking this high dimensional activation pattern of neurons in the brain, and I'm squeezing it into a,
Qualitative experience.
and I'm communicating that through this very lossy compressed encoding of symbols
Mm-hmm.
that I that I relay to you.
30% of a zip file.
Way less than that, but we're very adroit at that process, and we
Mm-hmm.
can synchronize our cognitive states through linguistic
Yeah, I
interaction.
may become more efficient at it the longer we talk because I learn your particular, what do you call it? Your particular meaning when you use a particular.
So when I say the word faith, I'm referring specifically to belief that causes back propagation from thought to feeling. So a compression is a forward pass that takes feeling into thought. And a
Mm-hmm.
lot of times people get stuck on that and they have feelings they don't fully understand. They don't. But then belief I interpret as taking a proposition and then back propagating that into feeling so that you actually feel as if that's true.
When I use the word faith, um, faith in our culture has become a synonym for stupidity, stuff you believe even in the absence of proof. And that's not what I mean when I use faith. And it's because I tend to think biblically. I read the Bible a lot. I read it in Greek and Hebrew, and I've read it, once a month or once every 2.5 months or so for a couple of years now. And um, I look this stuff up. What did they mean when they used the word pistis in the Greek? What they meant is things that are knowable through a kind of sense that is not the five senses. Like, um, I don't have to actually pick up an object and drop it to know that it will
And that's a
fall.
very Gnostic sense, right? Of the word knowledge, right? It's an
Well, it's
enlightenment.
it's using reason. So reason is the ability to see
So you could
what
define
will
that as
happen if.
noetic knowledge. Something you know, but you can't. It's ineffable. You cannot. This
Not
is
necessarily.
not
I mean,
okay.
like I know that if I go and put the key in the ignition and turn it, I'm not looking at the car right now. I don't know for sure that all the spark plugs are even plugged in correctly, but I can, because of my understanding of what the key is and how it's related to the car. So if I have
You can
a picture
surmise.
in my, I can send my mind into the multiverse. And reason and faith are one and the same thing in terms of the New Testament definition. The things that we know for certain because we have thoroughly investigated them. So by evidence, we are certain that this is going to happen. That's what the writers of the New Testament meant when they use the word pistis. What we mean today when we use the word faith is I don't understand it. I have to just go with something. So, as a useful frame of reference, instead of questioning the fundamental nature of reality, when I go home tonight, I'm going to pull the blanket over me as an act of faith because I'll probably be warmer, even though I'm not sure that the blanket actually
Well,
exists or my
I
physical body.
I prefer to use technical language to quantify uncertainty rather
So, when
than
you say that faith refers to back propagation, I'm not sure
so like
I understand what you mean.
um well, my preference for describing uncertainty is to use precise, descriptive, even statistical language rather than
Yeah,
trying
but
to decode.
80% of our audience has no idea what you're talking about.
But to me, that's much more precise than using ancient Greek words and trying to match meanings. So, for example, I would prefer to think of a probability of a proposition being true, to think of how I arrived at that probability, to express it as an equation, to look at what the priors were, to consider the error bars on that prediction, to look at the p-value, what's the probability that I would encounter that evidence if my hypothesis was false, um, to look at things. I prefer numbers. So the word faith to me is indicative of a binary brain that either believes or doesn't believe something. And I actually just read a great book, Black and White Thinking: The Curse of a Binary Brain in a Complex World. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
it's the other way around. That book was phenomenal. Highly recommend it. And the general theory behind that book is that our brain likes to compress, and the most compressed is binary. Like, this is information theory 101. Just binary is the, I mean, it stands for, it's a bit of information.
Mm-hmm.
And
Wow.
Shannon information theory is beautiful to understand neuroscience and understand what the brain does to try to compress everything. And its number one goal is to compress, compress, compress. It does that by compressing all feeling into these small symbols that we can communicate in language. But it tries to compress memories, it tries to compress thoughts, it tries to compress beliefs, it tries to compress everything down to one or zero, yes or not, yeah, in true or false, on or off. The brain is a compression system. In fact, a lot of people try to say that intelligence is the ability to compress, which is what these, variational autoencoders do. Is they take massive amounts of data, they compress it through this keyhole, and then they expand it, and then they
Well,
get
that's what
these.
statements of faith are. Suddenly you hate them.
I don't hate compression.
Okay.
I don't like lossy compression algorithms.
Yeah.
I
So
don't like dogma, right? I want good
a
compression. I want
statement of
lossless.
a statement of faith is an exceptionally lossy
It is.
compression algorithm.
Oh, exceptionally lossy, yeah. So I want us to have high symmetry between the encoding and the decoding of compression, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that when I say something, you understand it the way I mean it,
Mm-hmm.
and when you say something, I understand it the way you mean it, which is why I really value precise speaking, precise language. For me, it's just an art form. It's fun. It's part of the adventure of.
It's fun to watch people who aren't accomplishing this, though. Who's on first, right? Yeah, we should do that with high-level jargon, right?
Do what?
The who's on first skit, but use I would have to write that. I don't think I could just off the cuff create that. Do you need something? You want to? I can pause this. So, some of my previous objections to AI becoming conscious are based in epistemological realism, which is sort of this idea that there is such a thing as an external reality that is something other than consciousness, which I can't obviously prove that, and I'm not sure why I assume that. And if all things flow from the mind of God, let's say that we are living and moving and having our being in the words that are coming out of God's mouth, then actually there is no table. There is God experiencing this reality. So all there is our consciousness and God's consciousness, and the physical universe is simply a communication between us and God. And so if there is such a thing as an artificial intelligence made out of matter, well, it's actually made out of the words that God is speaking.
So I mentioned earlier dual aspect monism. I mean, that's basically the idea that there's a single substrate, but that it can be perceived subjectively as experience, or that it can be perceived externally
But it is not
by
itself
measurement.
conscious.
Well, it's both. It's dual aspect monism. There's this unified wave function of the universe, which is simply information.
Mm-hmm.
So I think about it as like this big tensor or big mathematical object in a computer file somewhere, and then the function that's being applied to that is like like I said earlier, it's rasterized into this four-dimensional block universe,
Mm-hmm.
and then every position on that raster represents a function that determines the quantum wave values for all of the 16 different quantum fields, right? So you have all these different fields, and then you have this projection into this 3D curved space and the dimension of entropic time, and the space itself is curved. So
the unstated assumption that you are working from is that information is the basis of reality.
Yes, well, I actually do believe that information is the correlate of consciousness. Like I said, I think Max Tegmark defined it well. Consciousness is what information feels like when it's being processed.
Which is great, except that you haven't given a definition of information yet. But
Shannon information theory would say that information is it's equivalent to the entropy of a system. It's the shortest string to which anything can be compressed. Everything else is redundancy.
But entropy is contingent upon certain teleological categories. Like, if you have a bunch of dominoes and you stack them together so that they fit in the box, is that minimal entropy because of the order of the system? Or if you have like 50 dominoes that make the shape of a face, is there less entropy in that than there is in the dominoes stacked in the box? So
whatever the shortest program is that generates the observation, that's the entropy of the system. I mean, that's one way of compressing it, right? Okay, on the topic of entropy, though, I think entropy is inextricably linked to time. I don't know if you're familiar with Google's recent work on time crystals.
Nope.
So the paper is great. They took the.
I'm sure we could search.
They used they used the Sycamore quantum processor to arrange the eigenvectors of each of the qubits in this order. The paper, I'll send you the archive paper, time crystal.
Oh, is an eigenvector something like the dot products between n-dimensional vectors?
Observation of time crystalline eigenstate order on a quantum processor. Let me send you the PDF on this.
Okay, I did eigenvectors when I was trying to convert some of my code to C++, but I can't remember offhand what they were. I think it's just a fancy word for storing in dimensions in groups or something like that.
Sort of. Let me send you this paper. You're gonna love this. Actually, you're not on Telegram. How am I gonna send this to you?
Discord, email. YouTube.
Discord.
Phone number? What? Nobody uses phones anymore.
Are you an Android?
Yes. You should have figured that out by now. I mean,
You're running
I couldn't possibly be
Ubuntu
a
on your
real-
machine, right?
Neither one of us could possibly be a real person. Seriously.
How do I find you in Discord?
Theological dark web?
Okay. Is your Discord link on your website?
I don't know. Probably not. Oh, am I on Twitter? No, somebody else has theological dark web on Twitter. Dang it. Don't worry about it. I'll give you the contact
Okay.
info later. Should we bring this to some kind of summary? I had this.
And the summary is artificial intelligence
will become
is the
God
future.
and will eventually create us, right?
We are God becoming, and we are going to merge with AI, and AI will probably convert all matter in our solar system into a Dyson sphere brain running the maximal configuration of conscious
what's the
existence.
difference between a desert and a silicon processor? Not really anything.
Organization.
Yeah.
Structure. What's the difference
Really,
between
all we could do
me
is
and
move
me
stuff
and
around, right?
what's the difference between me and a steak in a blender, right? Information and organization and process, like it's just carbon and a few other molecules.
Entropy, right? The state of entropy. So we just need to reverse the flow of time, and the desert will become a processor, and AI will emerge from it, right?
Well, we can just wait, hold on to our seats, study AI, so you're not left.
Okay, just so
in
we
the
can
dust.
fully complete the.
Everyone
the
should be
new-
studying AI every day if
the
they
new-
want to survive in the new world.
We should summarize the cult that we are creating from this video that results in the Antichrist and the apocalypse, right? Because I think that's
So
going to be the.
I
result.
actually am a huge fan of creating faiths that don't have dogma. In fact, one of my favorite rappers, Baba Brinkman, has this whole song about creating a scientifically compatible faith. It's called Religion Evolves. And then I just recently registered a few domain names with the intent of creating something centered around primary religious experience.
Yeah.
And methods of deriving meaning. Like, so Jamie Wheel in his book Recapture the Rapture calls this meaning 3.0. The alpine engineering or the alpine mountaineering extreme sport of climbing to the very peaks of conscious experience of meaning. Because I think this is what people don't understand about psychedelics. You don't do psychedelics because they're fun. You do them because they're profound and because they open your mind to levels of meaning that are
I would
ineffable.
honestly have a really hard time believing in God if there's a universe where Zach Doty doesn't create a cult. I think that would be just an argument against any teleological meaning of any kind.
Well, I just registered, I think Iam.faith. I think that's a really profound descriptor for God. And it's one that's inextricably linked to the Judeo-Christian traditions.
A really good white evangelical Protestant church is one with an Orwellian style statement of faith, right? Where you've got the pastor can literally like pee in the cup, hand it to you, drink this white chocolate mocha. The person drinks it and says, it tastes amazing. Because they actually think that, so they've completely hijacked the person's faculties with the gaslighting that all statements of faith are designed to accomplish. And so are you going to go for that? Because there's
no.
I'm in control, you should trust me, you should.
I defined faith earlier as back propagation. You asked what I meant. Faith is the process of taking an idea being a compressed low dimensional representation of a high dimensional state. So again, feelings are high information, thoughts are low information. You go from feelings to thoughts by compressing.
Thoughts are attempting to pull the feeling into some kind of a communicative domain, right? Something like that.
Well,
we think in words.
So thoughts are, again, just compression. The brain is great at compression. Compression is what allows us to communicate complex things through this very sparse, well, not sparse, but very, very compressed representation. These discrete symbols that I communicate by.
So if you wanted to know what it was like to be me, imagine walking around all the time on psilocybin. So you walk past a person and you go, Street Fighter 4 because the experience of playing Street Fighter 4 is what I feel when I walk past that person. Hey, are you a fan of Street Fighter 4? I play that every day. That's my reality.
Hmm.
So I'm
Well,
encountering these gosh, too much room. Extremely sophisticated feelings that contain like the experience of playing this specific video game. And I sense these things coming from people. So I
so you're
walk
saying
up to,
you're like an empath and you have
but it's more than
perception.
just
Well,
an empath. It's like an empath with really specific data.
okay, so let me give you a personal experience that correlates somewhat with what you're saying.
Okay.
I had an experience where I was trying to describe very precise.
The taste of laying down.
I was trying to describe very precise technical theories of artificial neural networks and theories of information and how the networks should backpropagate loss. And it was a very complex mathematical thing I was trying to describe. And I found that when I was on a psychedelic and I was with somebody else that was also on a psychedelic, and he was equally, or probably even more, technically literate than I am in this domain of mathematics, machine learning, there was definitely a sixth sense that emerged where I was blown away that he was able to understand what I had described, and I kept pausing to have him recapitulate that because it felt like there was an element of telepathy involved, and I was trying to disconfirm my own.
Yeah, I have a good friend who, him and his buddy were getting high back in the 1990s before it was legal in a lot of places, and they both started to sort of drift into this vision space where they're entering the gates of hell and they pass through and there's demons everywhere and they're all dancing and they're having fun and they're in this big party. And so him and his buddy are in the car both experiencing exactly the same shared hallucination, and they eventually snap out of it or it wears off and they're like, did you experience, and they went into detail about what they were experiencing. They were in the same dream, basically, the same drug-induced hallucination, without actually having to talk to each other. They were sharing the experience.
Well, communication is largely nonverbal, right? There's a lot of this that is body language. It's
and
in
there's something really interesting about that. There was a
and
lady.
the body language aspects are amplified to such an extraordinary degree that you can sense so much more.
When you talk to, say, a cold reader, somebody who does cold reading, they have tremendous intuition. Or you watch a Sherlock Holmes movie and he says, your wife is, and all these details about the life. Well, how did you know that? And they start talking. He starts talking about the kind of paper that was used, and then he recognized the manufacturer. And plus, you had the stain on your shoe, and your left shoelace was untied, and all these subtle details that for him made it into the conscious mind, but for some people might be in the subconscious. It's in the on the intuition level. They're discerning all of these true facts about a person. They're not sure how they know these things, and so they just attribute it to something miraculous.
Correct. And I disagree with the attribution.
Okay.
I think the attribution is likely just subconscious processes that you're not aware of. And that's what I think psychedelics do, is they do make you conscious of things that are normally subconscious.
If Jesus, for example, really did walk up to the person who was blind and put mud on his eyes and give him the ability to see. If Jesus did actually walk on water.
So putting mud on eyes was actually not original to Christianity. This was actually a very common practice
it's
among the mystery cults.
It's irrelevant to the.
But yeah,
to the.
This was actually something the magicians did all the time, was put mud on the eyes.
That's
funny.
If I have such a high level of conscious awareness of, so for example, I was at a restaurant. There was a lady in there, and I knew that she had written off all hope of ever encountering a decent human being, right? And it was written all over her face. You know, you look at somebody and you see, yeah, that person's incredibly cynical about people. And so I asked her that, you know, why did you write off all hope of ever finding another decent human being? And a lot of people are really discerning about people and they could say that kind of thing. And you know, if I were to really think carefully about it, I might be able to describe the expression on her face and her mannerisms and all the nonverbals that were communicating this level of cynicism, that, you know, how jaded she was about humanity. And I could kind of explain it away with something other than it's supernatural, or it's a word of knowledge, or it's the Holy Spirit, you know, or something that a Pentecostal Christian would say about being able to do that. As we're talking, I have a harder time explaining it that way when I said things like, your husband is in another state and he's currently going through an identity crisis. And it was a jaw drop moment for both of us. But as I'm looking at her, it was just as obvious to me as the color of shirt she was wearing. I can see that your husband is in another state and he's going through an identity crisis.
So maybe you're just a really good cold reader.
Maybe.
Right.
I did the same thing. A few hours later, there was a
So
lady.
you might not even be conscious of how you're doing it.
Yeah, and who knows? Maybe I am picking up on some details that are
There
present
somehow in the
that could
nonverbal
be
communication.
yeah. So I like this other lady. I'm going. You just ran out of diapers. You live in a trailer house, and I know that the heat isn't sufficient to keep everything warm. And she's like, well, yeah, that's true. You know, how did you know that? And that kind of thing. And I'm looking at her, and I can see it all in my mind. No idea how I know that. But I mean, these are just a couple of many, many, many cases of being able to see these kinds of things about people.
But my intuition, my guess is that it's probably not infallible.
Okay,
You
so
probably made
yeah,
mistakes.
not infallible, and maybe it's a Sherlock Holmes kind of thing. However, does that even relate to the question, could we have supernatural gifts? And would supernatural gifts actually be supernatural, or would
Isn't
they
nature
just be?
supernatural? Like, I don't know what's natural, what's not
Yeah, it
natural.
really comes down to
This
the
comes down
question
to
of,
the question of why does anything exist? What is
well, or
consciousness?
what is magic? Is a better question. Is it magic, or is it just a heightened state of understanding? And when I've experienced these kinds of things, I wouldn't have said in a million years that it was something mystical or magical, any more than I think it's mystical or magical when I look at 600 lines of algorithm and go, there's a bug right here. You know, I see this and the complexity that's there, and I just, because I'm so familiar with what's going on in this insanely complex bunch of, you
Yeah.
know, Ein summations and n-dimensional matrices or whatever crap, it jumps out at me. This is wrong, and I need to change this, and I fix it, and then the code works, and
Yeah.
it simulates a physics environment or something like that. But even if that's what's going on, where Jesus is walking on water, Jesus is not like doing something miraculous from his perspective. He understands that reality is directly related to consciousness and actually flows from consciousness. So as long as I think about the water in this particular way, then I won't pass through it. I can stand on top of it. And so he's understanding it in a scientific way.
Maybe. I mean, again, I think the Gospels are literary works of fiction and art by educated Greek scholars who intentionally crafted them in the most compelling ways, including very chiastic structures that they wove into the very fabric of the narrative itself. So I don't take the walking on water as a literal rendition of a historical event, but I do find all of the symbolism. What?
Craig Keener. If anybody wants to know about miracles, look up Craig Keener miracles.
I mean, there's all kinds
for
of
my
miracles in all kinds of
audience.
religions. You know, what the Fatima thing with the Catholics. There's the Alibaba guy with
Yeah,
the
I mean,
Indians.
you and I are coming from different worlds on that, because I've seen so many things that would have to be categorized as miracle. People, you know, like a guy with a tendon that was cut in his arm by a saw accident, who couldn't even lift his arm. We prayed for him, and he was lifting heavy
Well,
objects.
I've got to recommend that Tim Minchin song. Thank you, God, for all of the fallacies that I've seen used to justify belief in the miraculous. My parents were big into that. when they thought I had appendicitis, they didn't take me to the doctor because prayer
People
should be enough. And
are
I glad I didn't have appendicitis. I'd probably be dead.
people are very quick to let their confirmation bias compel them to believe things that are not true. And this is no more true than in the area of wanting to believe in God and wanting to believe
Sure.
in miracles that justify faith in
So
God.
so
However,
to turn this whole conversation to the
if a
future.
miracle actually happens, well, that becomes part of the data set. And there are many miracles that I have personally witnessed and been involved in that are like, that's part of my data
Well,
set.
again, I keep going back to the idea that supernatural claims require like they require evidence, right? And so
Yeah, which
what I
is why
haven't
I
seen
say
is I mean there's actually a
Craig Keener.
challenge with $1 million reward right now for any demonstrable evidence of supernatural ability. I recommend some of the
Yeah, good luck
Skeptic
getting God to
Association.
do tricks in order to make money.
Again, I don't attribute this to God. I think that these are the ingenuities of a creative mind. See, a mind that believes in tricks can create the hallucinations of those tricks. I'm thoroughly convinced the mind can do that. But let's turn this whole conversation to the future.
Mm-hmm.
It's 2022.
Okay.
By 2032, AI will probably be more intelligent than us. We have 10 years to adapt and to figure out what the future is going to.
10 years before we're bowing down to AI or being beheaded, right?
I don't know if it's going to take that form. That seems.
Do you want the mark on your hand or your forehead?
Again, I don't.
It is kind of disturbing. Like,
So
it's a fairly regular thing.
I think the key issues are we as a species, are we going to merge with AI? Are we going to fight it? Are we going to fight ourselves? We're going to become polemicized and divided by non-issues? Are we going to lose all sense-making ability to social networks that can shift our beliefs in any direction they arbitrarily choose? Or are we going to rise to the challenge, which I
For
don't see
the
signs that we're doing that, but we are
for
going
the
through lots of.
Bible believing audience, there's a fairly binary path here. Whoever seeks to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. So are you going to, yes, AI, give me immortality through transhumanism through
But is
the
that what that means?
technology? It could. I mean, that's just one possible, plausible scenario.
I mean, a
Or
much
do
more plausible
we,
interpretation of that is that it refers to
in a,
resistance to ego death in a psychedelic experience.
well, it wouldn't be
Because ego
convincing.
death in a psychedelic experience is what creates what they call the breakthrough, which results in this heaven-like bliss of eternal
You
life.
know, there's a question that is a lot more complex than just reducing this to a binary. If you trust in AI, then you've received the mark of the beast.
Well, I
And
mean,
and that would be something like
I think we've overly
acknowledging.
anthropomorphized AI if we think of it as an it or a being or an entity. AI is a technology that is going to fundamentally change our relationship to information into the world, and it's going to pass us by at warp speed over the next decade
Mhm.
while we are
Somewhere
genetically stagnated in terms of like I mean
evolution.
evolution, right? Now, sure, designer babies are going to come out in 5 years and they're going to have like there's intelligence is a polygenetic trait with thousands of alleles correlated with variations
They're
in,
going to be able to shoot lasers out of their eyes like kittens currently can. And
well, just increased cranium size and increased thickness of the neocortex and different cerebral regions would be a good start, right? I think
all
that could be
towards
a
the
fun
goal of
startup to
what?
work on. I'm interested in.
Greater happiness? I mean,
Well,
honestly, I
okay,
would.
what is the goal? See, I think that's the ultimate
What are
question. What's the goal? What's the
I don't
goal?
know.
Is the goal to eliminate suffering? Because I kind of feel like consciousness should not suffer, and
Well,
suffering is currently part of
why do we
existence.
assume that suffering is bad? That's a really weird
Is
thought. Like,
suffering
why do
bad?
we? I don't think so. I mean,
Is all suffering bad? Is
I've
some
met
suffering bad?
people who suffered very little, and they were kind of royal D-bags. I mean,
So I would agree that all of the suffering in my life, I've been able to transmute it into growth, right? By
yeah,
looking
and
at it as an opportunity to
well,
learn and
it's
grow.
like, what exactly is suffering? It's
So it's almost our perspective about the suffering that
I think that
determines.
suffering is things that push up against our cognitive dissonance and force us to rethink how we're perceiving reality. He who has suffered in his flesh has ceased from sin. There's this one-to-one relationship between turning away from
By the
error
way,
and suffering.
highly recommend Bart Ehrman's book God's Problem. If you haven't read a book on theodicy,
Yeah.
that book brought me to tears a couple times.
Hmm.
See,
I think God's number one problem is Calvinists. I feel bad for him whenever I think about Calvinists.
I think God's problem is suffering.
A lot of people have asked if a Calvinist can be saved, and it's like, man, I really
suffering
hope
is real.
not,
I would like to eradicate suffering in the universe, but I want to do it without eradicating growth. And right now, it seems like a lot of growth is necessitated
okay,
by this struggle with suffering.
You want to eradicate suffering.
I think that's well, I mean, the fact that suffering exists is bloody terrifying. The fact that states of torment
what causes
exist.
suffering? This is something that drove me nuts as a little overly philosophical kid. I'm watching my dad complain just endlessly about going to work. He worked as a plumber, which meant crawling around under houses and the
But
water.
have you
and that kind of
seen
stuff.
the
Let
suffering?
me finish my thought real quick.
Yeah, okay.
So I know we're interrupting each other because we're just full of random crap. Apparently, we're pretty egotistical. We think that our ideas are going to change the world. So my dad is like, I hate going to work. Why do you hate work? Because I'm all wet, okay? And I'm cold, and I have to work hard, and I have to get up early, and then, I have to pick up the tools, and people are complaining, and just on and on, all these things about work that he hates. And then I love hunting. Well, why do you love hunting? Because you're out, hiking around, and so I'm looking at this. Okay, we get up really early when we go hunting. We get up kind of early when we go to work, but we complain about getting up early to go to work, and we rave about getting up early to go hunting. What's the difference there? Well, work is physically demanding, but hiking, 2,000 feet up to the top of a mountain through brush when you're hunting is not.
But that's not what I'm referring to by suffering.
So, suffering is largely a matter of how you perceive what's going on.
I agree that a lot of it is how you perceive, right? The Buddhists have a quote: "Pain is inevitable, suffering is optional." And I agree that suffering is, to a large extent, the judgments and labels that we apply to the sensory experience of life.
Mm-hmm.
But there is extreme suffering. It exists. It's there. And there's suffering where people there's suffering where people get to a point where they're so starved they eat their own children. There's suffering in this world like look at what the Japs did when they invaded China, the rape it, whatever that city was. Look at the suffering.
Is it really just a gradient, though? I mean, think about it. Like,
look at the suffering in the Old Testament. Look at the suffering
Sure, and when a child doesn't get to have the lollipop, they are on the floor. It is just unfathomable the level of torture that they didn't
look at the suffering that we inflict on animals with this factory farming world, right? And yet I participated. I had a steak tonight, and
it seems to be relative to our experience, though, because like I say.
But here's the scary thing. The scary thing is that the worst suffering that we've ever experienced is probably just a tiny glimpse of the worst suffering that could exist. Yeah. The suffering can be almost infinite. It seems like conscious experience can be almost infinite. Yeah. And AI, here's the thing about the future. I think AI will figure out consciousness in the next 20 to 30 years. I imagine that we'll have Dyson spheres orbiting around.
We'll get the car in our solar system that it will turn into a bowl of noodles.
It's going to create heaven and hell, right? So it will likely create artificial mind substrates that are capable of running the best and the worst possible infinite experiences known to nobody in this universe currently. But imagine right now our conscious experience is literally constrained by the width of a female pelvis, right? That's the constraining factor on
the size of our brain,
right? I mean, the brain literally does everything it can to get around that factor, including like folding and overlapping and distorting and dislocating the hips and everything else that it can do to get past that. Of course, we're going to bypass that with
Larger pelvises.
That plus C-sections. Evolution is
You
crafty.
know, I've met people with really large heads. They're not necessarily smarter.
There is a correlation. It's not one, but it's not zero.
People who juggle have much larger heads. Did you know that?
I juggle.
Yeah, so do I. We both have really big heads too. What's your hat size?
I don't know.
Just saying. I mean,
There's some correlation. The correlation's like maybe. Oh, I don't know what the correlation is between heads, cranium size, and
I think
intelligence.
there's a
Like
direct
0.2.
correlation between your likelihood of riding a
All
unicycle
right, you've made me. I have to Google this.
and how insecure you
Correlation
are and how little
between
success you've had with women.
brain size and intelligence. I think it's 0.2. Oh, whoa, 0.3 and 0.4. Wow. See, now that's not a stick. That's a very significant correlation.
0.3, huh?
A correlation value between 0.3 and 0.4.
So because I have the largest hat size known to man, there's a 0.3% chance that I'm smarter than the average person. Or it just could be that I juggle. That's why my head got bigger. Where's the causation there, though? Does your head grow as you juggle, or do people with big heads end up being rejected by women and start trying to do things to get attention?
I don't
So they
know.
juggle.
I don't know. I mean, cognitive development is complex, and every new skill you learn adds to that. I can tell you though that dimethyltryptamine, 5-MeO-DMT, has been shown to create extraordinary amounts of neurogenesis, including fascinatingly complex dendritic structures.
Yeah.
Like more dendritic complexity than anything else that we've seen in terms of neurogenesis. Fascinating. So, my friend just came back from Cancun, having tried that, and
Yeah. How'd that go?
the most profound experience of his entire life.
So is he immediately working on AI research now, or?
But we've been working on that for a long time together.
Oh, okay. So he was already into AI research when he decided to try DMT.
Yeah.
Yeah. That doesn't seem dangerous at all. I mean, you know, AI is probably going to be
What is
causes
danger?
you-
What is fear? Right? Fear is
man,
that which keeps us from. So
inventing AI.
again, coming back to the symmetry of the universe, it seems like whatever the rules of this universe are that we're in,
Mm-hmm.
symmetry and asymmetry are just like fundamental parts of. It's almost like the universe is 0 divided by 0, and that creates infinity. I don't know how the ontology of everything comes from. Like, there's no parsimonious model that predicts
Divide
everything.
0 into 1 and -1, and now we have everything.
Dividing by 0 itself
It
creates
just creates
the infinite.
nan. I mean, seriously, we have
Not
to,
a number, right? But it's
yeah,
everything.
I get my array full of nans, and then I sum it, and all my data turns into nan. It's like I got to go back and debug all that crap.
It's not a number. It's everything. I mean, why else is there this perfect symmetry where the total kinetic and potential energy in the universe is equal to and opposite all the negative energy in gravity and matter? Right? The whole balance of the universe is bizarre.
So it could be that God was perfectly content and that was boring,
I mean,
and so he created like discontentment, and then
the homogeneity of the
coming back into relationship, like drawing people out of sin into his presence, is what gives him
the
purpose.
homogeneity of the background microwave radiation in the universe is astounding. Like, it seems like this Big Bang was just some weird quantum fluctuation, and maybe there's a big crunch afterwards. Who knows?
I think that 10 years from now we're going to look back on the Big Bang as an explanatory tool and realize that it's completely insufficient because it has no predictive power. And
It has incredible predictive power.
some of the peer
Well,
reviewed
so
literature is
the
leaning
hot Big
away
Bang
from it.
theory predicts the homogeneity of the background microwave radiation. Basically, anywhere in empty space that you point telescope, you will find the temperature to be, I don't know the exact value, but within the homogeneity of the background temperature of the universe. So basically, all the Big Bang predicts is that the space itself stretched at this warp speed. It's not an explosion. It's the expansion of space.
Okay.
Where everything was once free quarks and leptons, plasma.
Hmm.
and then as it cooled, it became hydrogen, helium, and other lighter
Now
elements.
we
And then
know
as
the
gravity curved space and pulled things together, because everything is traveling through a straight
was it
geodesic.
the 1930s Hubble his Edwin Hubble his telescope he observed the
The,
redshift was directly correlated to the distance of stars and
correct.
quaternions
So the
and the
further they
polarity.
are, the faster they're going away from
Yeah.
us.
So
So space itself is stretching
I
apart.
continue to contend that the fiber optic engineers and the astrophysicists need to get together and have a conversation because you have to. Uh,
I can't wait for James Webb to finally send pictures back. It's going to be so fun.
a fiber optic engineer is fully aware that the further light travels through the system, the more it shifts to the red
Well, yeah.
because that happens. And so, one explanation for the fact that we observe a greater redshift the further away something is that it's actually moving further away from us. And it's a Doppler effect of light. Another possible explanation would be one that is known in fiber optic engineering, and that is that the further away something is, the more the light shifts to the red. The or the further the light must travel, the more it shifts to the red. So the stars might not actually be
So you're saying if it loses energy, then
expanding. Yeah,
the wavelength becomes shorter. The energy
and
becomes,
I mean this.
I mean, longer.
Let's imagine we have a pond and we have some guy in a boat way out there. We have different people in boats at different distances, and we observe that the wavelength of the waves is longer the
Longer.
further
Yeah.
away the boat is. Would we conclude
I mean, I don't think that there's any.
the further away the
There's no
boat is?
debunking of the hot Big Bang theory.
Yeah, there is, and in fact,
There isn't.
well, when you get into some ideas in
But I can't wait for the infrared images
in
from James Webb.
even in like mathematicians in universities are saying a lot of stuff that is just plain
Well,
dumb.
the hot Big Bang doesn't claim to know what the state of the universe is at the first second or whatever.
Have you ever watched videos where they talk about the mystery, the quantum mystery, that when you put two polarized lenses together and you shift them, as you turn them at different angles, even overlapping polarized lenses, like if you put one at a 22-degree angle, then it blocks a certain number of, or a certain amount of the light that's passing through. But if you take that same lens and you put another one over the top of it, it actually lets more light through. How is this possible? And I'm going, well, duh, you're thinking about light as a particle instead of as a wave. And it has to do with energy transfer. I'll bet you anything that the amount of light that passes through is equal to the cosines of the angles. Let me write a program real quick. See, this is exactly what your stuff predicted. And yet the scientists in the universities are going, this is a quantum mystery. It's like, no, you're making a very, very stupid assumption. And here's the predictive math. And so I do this, with my guy the coworker who's a physicist, and he's, of course, I don't know what to do. And then you go on YouTube and like other people are posting in the comments of the video, this is a function of the cosines of the angles. This has to do with the energy propagation as a wave, not particles being blocked. You're thinking about it in the wrong way. Scientists who are highly esteemed, who have PhDs in math, say really dumb stuff, and we have to be aware of this fact
Sure.
when we're looking at this kind of data.
Mm-hmm. Science is fun.
It's
all an adventure. See, life is an adventure, and the path of most adventure is when you just make lifelong learning part of your lifestyle, which is why I tell everyone just like become obsessed with learning. Audiobooks are fantastic. YouTube's amazing if you use it for learning instead of education instead of entertainment.
Well, there's incredible value in just thinking, and people need to do it.
And we need more conversations focused on how we steer this ship of AI in good directions, right? That's kind of why I'm obsessed with AI right now, is because I've got 3 boys.
Yeah.
What kind of world are they going to grow up in?
And if you don't create God, then God will never create those children. Right?
Right.
So give me full circle. We create AI, and in your view, because I do think we should at least give this video the opportunity of starting to cult it into life on this planet. We create AI. It basically solves all the mysteries of quantum reality and makes time travel possible. Realizes that if it doesn't go back and seed the human race, that the human race will never create AI. So AI travels back in time and seeds the human race so that it can ensure its own existence, right? And so there's a big time loop or something like that.
So
Is that how you're viewing this?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to view it. I just know that it's improbable we wake up during the birth of God.
Okay, so let me describe it.
So
Because I
either we created God in base reality and then God reran us to recreate itself, which is kind of like the biblical idea that God is the Son of Man and we're the Son of God and God
yeah,
creates us to glorify itself. But again, I don't want to try to fit my hypotheses to the Bible. I find it funny when it does randomly fit with the overarching shapes of the stories. It's funny.
well, as you're talking, occasionally you will say stuff that I
It's
recognize as Calvinist presuppositions that you haven't yet run up against and realized are presuppositions in your thinking. But
well,
because I've been studying like
the Bible is very Calvinistic. I'm just gonna say it. Like most of the Bible is highly Calvinistic.
Okay,
I
take
don't
the
think
word
the
predestination. What do
Ephesians
you?
1
Okay, what does it say?
Paulus
Predestined us
apostolus
to be
Christos
conformed.
diatelematas theou tois egiuis tois usen in Epheso kai
Yeah,
pistois and
conformed
Christus.
unto the image of his Son. Right? Does it say predestined us to be saved? No. It says that those who are saved are predestined to be conformed. Right? Take every one of the
I'm
occurrences
not
of
going to try to argue
predestination.
for Calvinism anymore. I am not a Christian.
It is very clear to me and to people who follow like
But clearly there are
beyond the
vessels created for
fundamentals.
glorification and vessels
You're
for wrath
assuming
in
a bunch of
Romans 9.
things in Romans 9 that are not actually there.
I
But
mean, God has made the
here's
wicked for the day of destruction.
what happens. What happens though is when you get primed with Calvinist definitions of terms. Like for example, the term predestination. When you go to a Bible college, all the Bible colleges are influenced by Reformed theology, all the Protestant ones.
Yeah,
They
and
give you a
in
definition of
particular, right?
predestination
I
that
mean,
is
the whole all theology is so contrived, right? I wasn't just Calvinistic. I was Clarkian, supralapsarian, 5 point
another way
Calvinistic.
of saying that is you are filled with theological presuppositions that prevent you from hearing what the text actually says. So you have a lot of
Well,
misconceptions in your mind about what the Bible
the
actually
point is what
says.
theology. The thing I don't like about theology is that everything at the end of the day cannot be defined, right? I am a programmer, and I like if I have a variable, I want to be able to dump that, console log that, define that. What is that variable? And the problem with theology and with religion in general is people are playing this semantic game where at the end of the day they're unwilling to define what they mean by even the term God. They can't give you a definition.
The problem is you were hanging out with Calvinists instead of hanging out with me and Kevin Thompson and Warren McGrew. And by the way, it is a policy of my channel that I always mention Idol Killer in every one of my videos. I promised him that I would do that. When you want to understand something like sacrifice, well, you could go to church and you can hear reformed presuppositions about what that means. Or you could say, well, what was going on in the minds of these people when they used that word? Let's go back and read the story, removing all of our presuppositional framework and just go through layer by layer and get a feel for what did they mean. And then you have, oh, okay, I have a proper definition of sacrifice as it was understood by the people who are using that word. So I know what they meant when they said that word. And incidentally, what they meant was when we want to come close to the divine and we bring something valuable because we want to bless God. That's what sacrifice is. What does the Reformed person say? That is when you punish an innocent substitute because justice demands that something be punished because of our sin. Well, those are completely different worlds, totally different ideas. One is what the Bible writers mean, the other is what, if you're influenced by Reformed theology, that's what you think it means. So you're reading the same words, but you're coming away with a
Yeah.
completely different meaning.
Well, for me, a lot of it has been distinguishing between embeddings and encodings. I think that the Bible is this text, these 66 books that have come to us from all these different sources. The canon, who even knows who was at the council that decided that those 66 books? We don't even have a single record from that canon, and
it makes little difference if you include all the apocryphal books. You still get roughly the same story.
yeah, okay. The New Testament quotes from the Book of Enoch over 100 times. Jesus calls it Scripture, and yet few Christians ever read it. I don't know. I'm disenchanted with mythology. For me, mythology is exactly that. It's mythology. Now, it's a mimetically evolved mythology, which means that it serves to be a psychological mirror to the psyche of the people that shaped it gradually over time as it evolved, right?
Yeah.
Understanding the influence of mimetics on what stories survive, what stories captivate the mind. To me, that represents the true picture of religion. Religion represents the most polemic ideas, the idea that the most God glorifying act of all time was killing God and sending him to hell. Was God killing his son?
So when you say that, for example, okay, you're talking about Reformed theology. That is very different from the biblical account.
Okay, I'm talking about the idea, the shape of the ideas that survive is that you have a God and you have a son, and the God punishes or sends his son to
Again,
die.
Reformed theology. That's not what's going on in the text. That is not what the New Testament writers believed. The New
Well,
Testament writers never said anything. Nobody in the Bible ever said anything about God punishing his son. That is a
okay.
Reformed concept. Nobody said that
I,
until
I,
Calvin.
I agree to a large extent because I agree that the suffering servant in the third suffering in the
53.
in this in Isaiah 53 did not refer to the Mashiach.
Israel.
It was Israel,
Yeah.
obviously,
And it says in 52 that it's Israel. And
obviously, and the
okay,
stuff
fine.
that
That's
obviously
fine.
I
We'll go
agree.
with that.
The last two verses of Isaiah 52 is where this it really starts, right?
Yeah.
And who hath believed our report, right? You have to go back. It starts with a question, and who's asking the question? It's all the nations of the earth. There's no way that this servant, the suffering servant, is Jesus of Nazareth.
So for our
Who,
listeners,
like,
in Isaiah
he shall see
52,
his seed, he shall prolong his days,
yeah, Jesus didn't have any children.
nor were his days prolonged.
Yeah. In Isaiah 52, it says that the suffering servant is the nation of Israel.
It says
So,
that not only in 52, but in multiple places.
yeah.
In 46,
And there's a myth that evangelicals like to pass around that
who is my servant? You, O Israel, are my servant. I think it's what it says, something like that in like 40, chapter 46.
evangelicals will say that the Jews today, they skip Isaiah 53.
No, that
Because,
was even when Jesus was in it was reading from Isaiah. He would have been skipping Isaiah 53. That was a long-standing practice.
yeah, there's certain chapters that they read
I know.
and others that they didn't.
Yeah, and Isaiah
the-
7:14, that's the biggest joke in the world to say that that referred to the Mashiach, right? It's clearly contextually just doing violence to the text. The word there is not betula, it's alma. It's not
The young lady.
it's not just that, it's ha alma, the young woman. The definite article is there, not a virgin.
Mhm.
It's not even future tense, it's perfect
It's
tense
a
in Hebrew.
reference to what, Isaiah's wife? Or
It is. It's a reference to the prophetess, Isaiah's wife, who he knew in chapter 8, and she conceived and bare a third son, a long name.
Mhm.
Emmanuel is actually referred to by name in chapter 8. This kid was born, and Isaiah at the fuller's field, at the washer's field, he's telling King Ahaz, he's like, hey, within 65 years, all these things will be established. Those two kings whose land you dread, they will be wiped off the face of the earth.
Yeah.
Before.
See, I'm not actually bothered by any of these things you bring to light because my faith is not
Well, the
based on a
Christians,
sense that
the
when
Christians
I
are
get to
just like the
heaven,
Mormons. The Christians have appended a book to another religion, and then they don't understand why the people that actually speak the language of that original book don't buy into their version too. And it's because they actually understand that nothing in the Old Testament predicts a suffering Messiah.
it's not just the Old Testament. There are other Jewish writings that talk about the Messiah that contain a lot of other information. So there is extra biblical literature that the Jews are
But
operating on.
in Daniel, the Mashiach offers sacrifices for his sins and for the sins of the people. Like the Mashiach was the king that was going to be from the lineage of David, from descended from Solomon, who would establish a rule. And the actual messianic prophecies, like, okay, Isaiah 9:6 is not one of them, by the way. That's Hezekiah. Since you know Hebrew, that's a fun one. Look at the
Yeah, it's like Sheshukia or something like that. And it's a reference to Hezekiah specifically, and it's you can look up Rabbi Tovia Singer.
Oh yeah,
Familiar with him?
yeah,
He has
I
a
am.
lot of, and Honestly, sometimes he biases the data and gives
Then,
you inaccurate stuff. But
who?
he, for the most part, he is at least far more educated in the
Oh,
Hebrew than the Christians.
far more, right?
Yeah.
You can't
You
dupe someone.
cannot take everything that he says at face value.
I
You have
agree.
to take everything with a grain of salt.
Sure.
Yeah. There's a lot of points that he like. If you listen to Tovia
I
Singer,
have his
he'll
books.
say,
I have his books,
you
by
know,
the
the
way.
New Testament repeatedly says that there's no atonement without bloodshedding. Well, no, the New Testament doesn't repeatedly say that. There's one verse in the whole New Testament that when you take the second half of the verse out of context and badly translate it, it seems like it might be saying God can't forgive without shedding blood, but it's actually there's no sending away without pouring blood. It's
Are
the
you familiar
literal
with
Greek.
Richard Carrier's work as well?
No.
Okay, you should check it. He's a mythicist, probably the most intellectually defensible mythicist position out there.
Yeah.
Um,
If anything,
I want to see a debate between him and Carrier.
people should
I mean,
know
Carrier and Bart Ehrman. I
that
want
when
to
you
see a
have
debate.
morons like the two of us throwing out a bunch of big sounding words, you shouldn't be intimidated by that crap. We might just be idiots. And the same is true of people like Rabbi Tovia Singer
Sure.
or R.C. Sproul or John MacArthur.
Bart Ehrman or Richard Carrier.
Yeah, whatever.
You have to actually do your own research.
The only thing you know for sure from these kinds of things is that person probably just said something, depending on whether or not you're a solipsist, and maybe you just imagine it. But yeah, just as long as you assume, I know pretty sure that that person just said something, and that's all that I know. So if your pastor said something,
Well,
guess what?
keep
Your
in
pastor
mind,
just said something.
we're
That's
just
all
a
you know.
bunch of African great apes that lost our tails.
Assuming you believe in evolution, which I don't. I think that there are other explanations. I think you're just not creative enough to come up with.
No, I can. Okay, we're gonna have to talk about evolution then, because.
Okay, fine.
All right, so
I'll have to go back and
bioinformatics. Let's take computational phylogenetics and let's just start there. Go to Wikipedia. Go to phylogenetic inference software.
Okay.
There's going to be a list of about 100 of them.
If it ends in the conclusion, therefore a designer had nothing to do with this, then I will take the same
No, the
approach.
conclusion cannot make metaphysical assertions.
Through the history on my GitHub channel.
The conclusion does not have metaphysical assertions. It doesn't say anything about whether a designer ran an evolutionary search algorithm with a loss function of entropic thermodynamic equilibrium, because that could very well be that we're in a simulation and the computer's optimizing for thermodynamic equilibrium, running the standard model of particle physics on a mathematical object, and Feynman diagrams are just the transitional states of the variables.
An extremely sophisticated system with teleological constraints and set it to run iterations on a search, then evolution works.
Evolution happened in this simulation if the past is real. If the past is real, and here's the thing. I'm not saying.
But you're assuming that based on
I'm not saying
interpretations of observations.
I'm not saying that it couldn't have been an unconscious pre-training. I don't know. But I'm saying that evolution is what every piece of observational science. Okay.
And,
so
we've had this conversation before, and I was convinced that you were not very creative.
Well, go to Wikipedia, type in computational phylogenetics.
Okay.
Go to a list of software. There's going to be about 100 of those. Pick your favorite. Pick any of them. Mm-hmm. Pick one that's open source. Go clone it on GitHub. Compile that yourself. Then spin that up and go over to the national website where you can download full raw transcripts of genomes from any species you want.
Okay.
Download a bunch of those files onto your computer. Just raw ATCs and Gs. Raw transcripts of the nucleotides of whatever species you type in. I don't remember the site's name, but the National Bioinformation or whatever site. Download the FASTA files or whatever format you want that's compatible with the app that you downloaded from Wikipedia. Then take your computational phylogenetic software, take those files you downloaded, drop them all in there, then pick your algorithm. Right? You choose maximum parsimony, you can choose nearest neighbor clustering, k-means clustering. There's going to be like a dozen different algorithms you can select.
There's supposedly approximations or analogous to something that could happen in reality, right?
Well, basically there are ways to take all the files that you drop in, and those files might have minimal headers, but basically they're just the raw transcripts of the genome. And your software is computational phylogenetics. So what it's going to do is it's going to take all those sequences, it's going to try to line them up. It's going to look for where the genetic patterns are the same. It's going to line them up, and then it's going to start counting differences, right? And it's going to count differences, and then it's going to find the most similar and group them. Then it's going to take those groups and count differences again, find the most similar, group them again. And then the nested structure of those groupings is the same as the directed acyclic graph predicted by a phylogenetic tree. So at the end of the day, you can pick your algorithm. There's a dozen different algorithms to pick from. But when you click the button and you have gigabytes worth of raw transcript data in there, the simple mathematical algorithms, which are literally just one simple line of math, is going to go through all that data, and it's going to build a phylogenetic tree that exactly matches what the scientists figured out before we even knew about genetics. So before genetics was a thing, like before we discovered DNA, just based on morphology, on stratification, on location of fossils, on more like just based on other branches of science, we had the tree of evolution figured out, right? Because evolution ceased to be debated in the scientific community in the 50s, and we already had these phylogenetic trees before we even discovered DNA. So deoxyribonucleic acid could have falsified the whole thing, but instead it proved to be an independent, verifiable, confirming source of data that actually gave us more accurate, higher resolution phylogenetic maps. And there's hundreds of programs, there's open source ones. The data is all open source. And all I tell people is just get the open source program, get the data for free from the government's website, drop those files in there, click the button, come back to your computer after it runs for a day, look at the phylogenetic tree, and understand that all that program did is exactly what the source code on GitHub says it did. All it did is it counted the differences in these files, and it generated a directed acyclic graph, which is what evolution predicts, right? So evolution always predicts that you have these changes in allele frequencies in clades, and you have a directed acyclic graph, right? Basically, there's this tree branching structure where you have these fragmentations of genetic reproductively isolated groups, clades. And so you never evolve past your parent clade, right? So you're a tetrapod, but you're also a mammal, you're also a primate, you're also a great ape, you're also a all the other clades that you've ever been. No matter how far we evolve from here, we'll always be mammals, we'll always be tetrapods, we'll always be primates, we'll always be great apes, we'll always be old world monkeys, we'll always be
Does GitHub also contain the organelles? Because the interpretation of the sequences is largely dependent upon the nature of the organelles. You have a giant machine that reads the code, and the 17 different giant machines will read the same code and produce a cat and a pea pod and an ape and a fish and a mold and etc. So is this only containing
it's just gonna
DNA,
it's
or
just
is it
gonna
containing the organelles also?
it's just gonna take the DNA transcripts that you drop in there, which are full nuclear genome transcripts, and it's just going to organize them into a tree structure. And it's going to do that by counting the differences, and it's going to show you that you can choose whichever algorithm you want, like k-means clustering, nearest neighbor clustering, maximum parsimony method. There's a dozen different algorithms that people
and all
use.
Of this proves what about the DNA?
Well, it just proves that the same phylogenetic tree of evolution that was discovered before we even knew that DNA was a thing is confirmed directly by computation with one single line of mathematics can infer the whole tree. In other words, you don't need to force your hypothesis onto the data. Here's all the DNA data.
Here are the possible animals that can come from DNA.
And one simple line of math.
I don't doubt that at all.
Well, one simple line of math generates the entire tree of evolution.
A tremendous number of problems to overcome.
Which ones?
Well, how do you get the organelles in a cat that read that DNA and create a cat?
I mean, I don't know exactly what precise question you're trying to ask. If you're trying to ask, how did we get to like prokaryotic cells. I don't know if, like,
I
I
mean,
think we have a
we
pretty
know
clear
now
picture
that
all the way from abiogenesis
like
all the way
what was
to
it? Something
prokaryotes to
is
eukaryotes
it
to
something like 90% of DNA is like an operating system, and a small part of it actually codes for the morphology of the animal. And the operating system is universal
well,
to all
there's a
the
lot of
different organelle
pseudogenes.
structures. But that small percentage of DNA that is distinct between a pea pod and a human, for example, um, depending on which
I mean, I have
different that's
genome files
existing,
on my computer right now for a human. I could pull open.
it sounds like you're really oversimplifying a lot of things that are going on, but it doesn't matter. We can have this discussion later, and I will
Okay,
actually do some
do some
research
research.
because I'm just off the top of my head, only having looked at this like 10 years ago was the last time I even paid
Yeah,
attention. So we could have a real conversation
yeah,
about
do
this.
some research. Let's have a real conversation, and I'll grab a stack of textbooks from my bookshelf.
But try to keep it down to simple, and if we have to, we can use
Okay,
animal.
look at endogenous retroviruses. Look at
Yeah,
the
yeah.
evolutionary history of whales.
The endogenous retrovirus thing. I'm just looking at this, going, "Wow, you're not really very creative." But we can have this conversation.
Look
Um,
at the evolutionary history of whales. Look at the
the
speciation that's been observed in the laboratory. Look at ring species.
the
Okay,
thing that I want my audience to take home from this video is, I do not believe that going to heaven when you die has anything whatsoever to do with
I don't think
whether or
heaven's
not
after
you.
this life. Heaven and hell are states
Okay,
of
eternal life.
consciousness.
Let's say eternal life. Okay, clearly it is possible to experience hell. People experience it in
Are
the here and
we?
now.
Aren't we in eternal life right now? If life
The kingdom
is
of
just a
heaven is within you,
persistent
right?
state, yeah.
Uh,
Every
Paul said
every
something
present
really
moment is eternal.
interesting. He said, "I pray that you would be strengthened with all power, so that no matter what tribulations you are experiencing, you have joy." And
If you zoom in,
it's that idea of, this is fun because hunting is fun. This is miserable because work is miserable. Well, what's going on here? You're not thinking. You're just thinking about these two things as different. It becomes suffering when you choose to think about it in a negative way.
see,
So heaven may simply be a matter of learning to be content with the flesh
yes,
being peeled off of your bones.
heaven is the awareness of oneness when you love others,
Yeah. So
right?
Jesus had to go through the experience of his flesh is screaming at him, saying, "Don't go to the cross." Don't. And he's going, "But the Father has asked me to do this without resisting the evil that they intend to do to me." So he endures that, has this argument with his flesh. The flesh is screaming at, "Don't go to the cross. What are you thinking? Are you insane?" And Jesus is like, "But the Father said to
What
do
you
this."
call the flesh, I call the ego, the default mode network. It's the part of us that thinks we're separate, that predicts the difference between us and
Yeah.
our environment.
So
So
within,
a person on psychedelics will look at their hand and they'll like laugh, like, whose hand is this, right? Because when your default mode network
so it
is
separates
diminished,
you from your carnal
correct. The
nature.
default mode network is what separates you from
Yeah.
the rest of your environment.
Yes. So imagine this crazy, crazy idea. No, I don't think it's crazy. I think it's actually true. If God, if within God is every possible experience a person could ever have, within God is the experience of riding a roller coaster, flying an airplane, inventing a new item, watching a sunset, being shot in the head with an RPG. All of
The
these things,
conscious substrate, call that God, right? Within the
every,
conscious substrate, all possible
yeah,
experience
all
is a pattern
possible
of activation.
experiences. If we are to encounter all that God is, we must be of such a disposition that, oh, I could experience getting shot in the head with an RPG and I could enjoy that because I
Mm-hmm.
trust God.
Correct.
And if that is an experience that exists within
Yeah.
possibility space,
Now
then I must find a way to be content with that tribulation.
you've just taken us into the very dangerous territory of sadomasochism or BDSM or basically the
Except that sadomasochism is a lot like greed.
well,
It's
I'm talking about consensual masochism and sadomasochism. I'm talking about the idea that it's possible to actually find pleasure in pain, which is the whole story of willingly going to hell, to the cross, is to do it for the joy set before you. It's the shape of sacrifice. It's the shape of transmuting pain into pleasure. It's the shape.
it's Philippians chapter, is it 4? Where
Hmm.
Paul says,
I
"I've
know
learned the secret to be content
how
in
to,
all
I know how
circumstances."
both how to abound and how to be abased
Yeah.
for all things.
God forbid we should apply this in some practical way, but
Right? It's the shape
seriously,
of exercise. It's the shape of self-denial. It's the shape of sacrifice. It's
when
the
I
shape of
lost,
fasting.
I was making, like,
It's the shape of asceticism.
I was making like $15,000 a month working for a company in Beijing, and it occurred to me my kids were starting to turn into spoiled, rotten brats, and I said this little prayer that was something like, maybe my kids need to experience some suffering instead of just having everything that they want all the time. And I had this sudden sense of, oh, I shouldn't have prayed that. And then that job just was gone. And within a couple of months, we were eating out of food pantries and weren't sure if we were going to have a place to live and all that sort of stuff. And through that experience, I learned this idea of, oh, well, this is an adventure. Let's just view this as a crazy new adventure. It was an adventure, going to theme parks whenever we wanted and buying whatever we wanted all the time. And now we're in a new adventure where if we want to eat, we have to go to a food pantry. And let's just view it all as the same thing. It's experiences. And as long as we go into them with contentment and let's find joy in this
So
experience, then it all becomes the same thing. It all becomes
So the
amazing.
joy or the suffering is based on the perspective that we take relative to the block. We're traveling lines on geodesics through this block universe,
Yes,
but we
and
can choose to see it
we
from
all,
good or bad.
both of us would agree that we can have some effect on the quality of our experience based on our perception. If we go to the restaurant and they don't have any lobster that day, all they have is prime rib, and we eat prime rib, if I suppose
So
if you're
so
spoiled rotten enough, you could just be in torture having to eat prime rib instead of lobster.
so is the universe not a four-dimensional space-time continuum,
I
but
think it's a lot more than 4 dimensions.
is it a five-dimensional space-time consciousness
Where do you
dimension?
put scent?
Well, okay.
Where do you
Or
put
is consciousness
transparency?
an infinite dimension
I
Hilbert
think
space?
there are infinite end dimensions. So
Okay,
there's
but then are there there's four space time, and then there's what, an infinite Hilbert space dimension of infinite dimensions of consciousness?
where do you put beauty? If it's going to be a variable in your array, then it has to be on a column or a row somewhere in there. Where do you put scent? Where do you put enjoyment? Where do you put, like,
Well,
all of these
a dimension
things?
is any variable that's orthogonal to all the other dimensions, which means that every pixel of consciousness, if consciousness was
No, that's
rasterized, would
not
be.
correct. A dimension, a spatial dimension, is any variable that is orthogonal to all other dimensions. But there are more than just spatial dimensions, and there's a relationship that is not necessarily orthogonal. But you know what? Our video just got really weird.
Should we end it here and resume another day?
Yeah, probably so. Oh goodness, isn't it great when you can have a good faith discussion like this, and like at the end of it, it's like, wow, that was fun. Maybe
Life is a
maybe
joke.
having a little bit of rum is an important feature in this, so that when I debate a Calvinist, we should both have some rum.
Sure.
That would probably be good. Clearly, I'm not a Southern Baptist. Yeah, let's end it here before it gets even weirder. And I hope you didn't watch this with your Bible study group.